directly to the person. Of course, the authors would have to provide these timestamps, but I think it's doable in this context of these talks.
Yeah, some of the longer videos online, people are doing that. Like this many songs that put into one video, and it provide this sections of the marks. You can click those, but I'm not sure that can be done automatically so far. Probably manually done. Yeah.
Right.
Let's see.
Eitan doesn't seem to believe in video for me.
I'm just almost set up. I'll be right there in a second.
Pity we don't have a computer graphics expert.
Pretty much.
I'm going to be careful with the jokes.
He's a computer sound expert.
Yeah.
All right.
So often people are afraid of releasing unpublished contents in presentations, and I'm wondering if the fact that we can cite a paper and that the video is archived will change the habit.
So, John, I have one slide on the work we're doing together that is not published yet. So at least
take it out.
at least it's covered by the potential citation.
Sure.
Oh, hi, Aditi.
To finish writing the article.
We'll finish writing it soon.
How are you?
Exactly.
Hi, Aditi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Okay, I see the time advancing.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. I still don't see a video of Eitan. Actually, I have one question. So we have this beautiful photograph in the poster, and I can't identify it. I mean, it could be EPFL campus, but I think not, right? Where's the picture of the trip? Is it Grenoble or?
We won't give too much away. You can hear part of the story during the talk.
Oh, I see. All right, that's gonna come. All right.
It's not in Switzerland.
Aha. Okay. Right. Grenoble's not in Switzerland. So, okay, but we'll find. Yes, we'll wait.
Okay, John Hutchinson is here.
Can you make me a co-host so I can share?
Okay, sure. I'll make
Not
you...
now, but later on.
Yeah, it's okay.
Hi, I'm looking forward to this.
Hi, John.
Hey, John.
Great,
Hi,
hi.
John.
Hi, everybody. Gee, there's Yuhan too. Yeah,
Hey, Joe.
hi.
Hey, John.
Hello,
John, we
John.
cannot see you.
Oh, yeah, well, you're not missing much. There I am.
Oh, John.
So I'm going to be interested to see how you guys pull this off.
Well, we'll try.
We'll be interested too, because we haven't rehearsed as much as we would like. We had liked.
No,
John, you're
honestly,
making
you rehearsed.
John, you're making them nervous now.
Yeah.
How long will be the whole talk? Hello, Pedro.
Hey.
Oh, there's Nan Shu. Hi.
Hello, John.
I haven't seen you a long time.
I see you quite often.
And Liwa. Hi, Liwa.
Hey, John.
Okay.
Hello,
so
everyone. I'm online now.
Ah, there he is.
Yes, hi.
Wow, that is green. That is seriously green.
I was busy choosing the right shade of green.
Right. Well, it's quite memorable. Let's have a vivid impression.
Possibly
Anyway.
blinding.
It's fine, I'm sure. Okay, so we have very successfully got me off the hook because I was supposed to interview you guys, but then I wasn't quite sure how to do that, and everybody's been saying hello. So now we're down to 3 minutes. So we only have to fill in 3 minutes, and Pedro is ready to go on a moment's notice. Pedro has disappeared, but anyway. I mean, of course, now I guess everyone uses the now in the in the days of COVID or in the time of COVID, we're all learning new things, new ways of interacting. It could be we don't have to spend so much time on airplanes anymore. And I've never chaired one of these, and I've never chaired either a video conference or a real conference where there's 3 speakers. It's going to be 3 times as difficult to control them, but they've all promised to behave. So I will say welcome to everybody. We're about to hit triple figures for participants. I'm watching the numbers click up. I guess everyone has seen the poster. There's going to be a triple presentation with Basile Audoly from what we here call the real École Polytechnique outside Paris.
Yeah.
Eitan Grinspun is there in vivid green from the University of Toronto in computer graphics. And then the host of the electronic slides will be my colleague Pedro Reis from the EPFL.
John, before you do that, can I take maybe a couple of minutes to just show one slide? This is Jimmy Xiao.
Okay.
This is our editor-in-chief of Extreme Mechanics.
In that case, I better say yes.
Okay. All right. So let me share with you one slide.
There we go.
Okay, so I'll just take 1 minute. We have a little celebration today. Okay, so the first ever EML webinar was held on April the 15th, exactly 3 months ago, out of the brilliant idea of Zhigang Source. So we have a little celebration, and the inaugural webinar speaker is Professor John Hutchinson from Harvard. And we're very glad that he's also here. So let me show you what he presented. He presented something called New Developments in Shell Stability on April the 15th. And during that time, John mentioned a young researcher's name several times. And I believe John's interest in stability or instability was revived because of his interaction with this young researcher. And the young researcher turns out to be the speaker of the day today. So John, you want to say a few words?
Wow, you caught me off guard. I'll just say that Pedro provided lots of stimulation for me, and I'm still living off that stimulation. So I urge everybody to pay attention to him and also to Etienne and Basile.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much, John. So for those of you, we strongly suggest or encourage you to watch the video of John's webinar. And the YouTube link is over there. And also, thanks to the extremely or infinitely resourceful associate editor of EML, Teng Li, we also have a Weibo website. So for those in China, you can watch the Weibo video. And so John's work or presentation is somehow related to what Pedro and his team is going to present. It's interesting that not only Pedro is here, he brought his collaborators. So there are 3 of them. We all know that a stool with 3 legs is the most stable configuration, but they want to talk about instability. So I don't know what, it's an interesting concept. We're looking forward to it. So John, I'm turning it back to you.
I think you don't need to. I think we can now move directly to the trilogy of rods. Pedro.
Okay, very good. So I'll share my slides. Please tell me if this is either working or not working.
It's working for me.
Working, very good. Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the invitation to give this webinar. And so we'll introduce ourselves in a second. So this is the culmination of many years of collaboration. So the first project I collaborated on with Basile dates back to 2002 or so, when I was still a grad student. A few years after that, Basile and Eitan met, and they then started working together. A few years later, Eitan and myself collaborated after being introduced from Basile. So we've actually never collaborated, the three of us together. So that will be an interesting outcome that you'll see from these slides. But there's really been an interweaved and the braid of collaborations. And so today we really want to focus on sharing our experiences, and we'll share these experiences with examples. And so we've decided, we've worked on different things together other than elastic rods, but we've decided so that we have a running thread, excuse my pun, to really focus on thin elastic rods as a running theme. So maybe we'll start by first each of us giving a bit of an overview of where we're coming from before we mix it all together. So let's see, Basile.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm working in the laboratory of solid mechanics at École Polytechnique in Reis, and I'm fascinated by slender structures. There's a duality because slender structures are an old subject, part of the typical basic engineering teaching, but it's also a very vivid subject of research with many basic questions that are still ill understood, even in very simple problem. So if you take this cylindrical party balloon, for instance, it looks simple, but if you inflate it, it doesn't inflate by expanding its radius uniformly. Instead, it's going to make a bulge like the one you see in the picture. So the bulge will grow to a given radius and then invade the entire length progressively. So it's a very non-uniform way of growing. Actually, this is quite well known. I mean, it's one of the examples of localization. But basically, the current work on this system in particular is typically using a nonlinear membrane theory, which is essentially a 2D theory. And if you look at this system, it really looks like a 1D system from far. So the type of questions that I am really interested in at the moment for these slender structures is really to identify the good 1D models that capture all the mechanics and all the phenomena while remaining accurate. So in that particular case, Claire Lestrangon and I derived a 1D model, which is described on the right, which is extremely accurate and also justified and captures the shape quite nicely. And at the same time, it's quite simple. So can you show the next slide, Pedro? And so this complexity and the fascination for slender structures actually covers many different aspects. And in particular, complex structures can be very rich and lead to intriguing phenomena when combined with plasticity, as shown on the right. So that's a recent work with Chiara D'Araio and her team at Caltech. But you can also add pre-stress or dynamics or viscous flows, and you get all kinds of rich and interesting phenomena where geometry plays a central role.
Thank you, Basile. So first, I just want to say that it's a real pleasure to be speaking here, and thank you to Pedro for suggesting that we give this talk together. So my name is Eitan Grinspun, and I'm at the University of Toronto, and I develop computer algorithms that are powered by geometry, as I like to say. So what I mean by that is I like to identify the key geometry underlying a problem. And when we talk about the geometry of slender structures, we're immediately thinking of differential geometry. So smooth curves and surfaces, quantities such as tangents and curvatures. But at the same time, I'm a computer guy, and computers are inherently discrete. So to make the mathematics readily computable, I need to work with discrete objects such as straight lines and nodes or vertices. Unfortunately, the quantities from smooth differential geometry, such as curvatures, are not immediately well defined when you talk about a piecewise linear geometry. What does it mean to define curvature properly in this case? So there are various communities in mathematics and even in finite elements and also in computer graphics that have been coming together to develop different types of discrete differential geometries from the ground up. Next slide, please. And I've been involved in the development of these discrete differential geometries, but also in building them into computer algorithms for computer graphics applications. And in computer graphics, we really care about instabilities because stable things are boring. I mean, imagine watching a movie where the building is just standing stably and not doing anything. Much more interesting to see it fall and collapse and explode. So instability is attractive and dynamic. And so we've been applying instability for computer animation, making virtual hair and animated characters and virtual clothing on animated characters. We've also been applying the simulation tools in robotics and in the design of physical artifacts. So making interactive tools for users who want to, for example, build something from a material that would be less intuitive. I look forward to sharing some of that with you today.
Okay, so on our end, we have the Flexible Structures Laboratory here at EPFL, where we've been for a few years now, and we're really experimental group at the core. So we develop these precision desktop experiments, reduce model systems to study the mechanics of structural systems. And now, when we talk about structures, of course, a lot of engineering is over here. So if we have a loading axis, we're trying to create lighter, cheaper, tougher structures all the way up to critical points. And our vision is really to go beyond critical loading points and explore the post-buckling regimes for function. And so this is actually terminology that I've borrowed from Eitan. He came up with these terms first. And so this idea of leveraging instabilities for function, which he calls Buckley-philia, as opposed to Buckley-phobia, the more standard approach to instabilities in mechanics. Now, so our focus is really on slender structures, so objects that are thin. And as we all know, we can place these objects in three big buckets, so rods, plates, and shells, which is even the title, used to be the title of many courses taught in theoretical applied mechanics departments. And what's very nice about all of these systems is that the mechanics, the behavior is scale invariant. And so we can develop these precision experiments at the desktop, at the finger scale, to gain insight that then enable the development of models that we can then scale up or down to the original application. And so today we'll be sharing primarily work on this bucket of thin elastic rods.
So that's a picture taken recently in a workshop last year in Grenoble that was organized by Florence Bertaille and myself. And the idea was really to bring together the mechanics and computer graphics community. But all this really started back around 2003 when I collaborated with Florence Bertaille and Marie-Paul Cani, who were from the computer graphics community and on the topic of hair simulations. I met Eitan soon after by attending a conference in graphics, and around that time I was also collaborating with Pedro separately.
I'd actually heard of Basile a bit earlier because my advisor at Caltech had been sending around this ignoble video of someone explaining Feynman's breaking spaghetti puzzle. And so it was quite surprising then to meet Basile at SIGGRAPH, a graphics conference, and be like, wow, this amazing physicist who has this solved Feynman's puzzle is right here. I need to do something with him. And as we started talking, we saw that we have a lot of different interests. They were written on the back of this slide when the slide started. But really, as we talked more and more, and the same thing applies for the discussions that I've had with Pedro and that I think Basile has had with Pedro, all of the various interests that we've had kind of recede into the background when compared to our real focus on the geometry of the problem. And so that's going to be the running theme today, is a focus on how the geometry of the problem really dominates our thinking about the problem. So with that, I think it would be fun if we just went through a case study, and we've already been talking a little bit about hair. and I did my hair this morning. So maybe Basile and Pedro, you could share one of your recent hair projects, and we could start with that.
Okay, so I guess it's appropriate that we're talking about this test case on curly hair, and I'll start on that. And so when first want to give you a general idea of how we go about thinking about the experiment. So even though we're an experimental group, by the time we develop a certain experimental system, we're already working with abstractions. And so we're trying to reduce the problem to its bare essentials, so that we quantify and measure things at the level of detail that it's appropriate to then inform the next step of physical understanding. And so this is how I think about a curly hair. So I fabricated very precisely a series of rods that have all properties identical other than natural curvature. They are suspended from a clamp, so they are loaded under self-weight, and they have three different shapes. So here the shape is perfectly straight when the curvature is 0, and then it becomes increasingly curly, but in the plane, and at some point there's a loss of stability and three-dimensional shapes develop. And so having such a simple system now allows us to quantify things in detail. So just as an example, I'm plotting on the x-axis the angle that is blue arrow, the tangent to the center line of the rod, makes with a vertical. And so as I go along the arc length, of course, this angle is evolving because the shape is three-dimensional. And so this is a metric of the 3D geometry of the rod. Okay, so now having this experimental data, I call Basile and say, Basile, I have a problem, and he comes to the doctor comes to fix it.
So from the model perspective, the system is just an elastic rod, so slender 1D object with natural curvature and weight. These are the three main ingredients that are needed here. But you see that even though it's simple, there's a great variations in the shape just by changing the amount of curvature, and that's a signature of a nonlinear response, which is not just directly proportional to the curvature. So if you want to set up simulations of this system, you can use the classical Kirchhoff rod equations, which we are going to present next. And that gives rise to a nonlinear boundary value problem, which luckily is 1D. But since it's a boundary value problem, it's not the kind of things that you can solve just by integrating forward, and some specific methods are required. So in that case, we use the MANLAB software and the extension done by Arnaud Lazarus. And the nice thing with the type of bare minimum experiments that Pedro is advocating is that it works well with numerics, and it works well with theory, because that's something that you can hope to address using simple models and not too complex numerics. So in that case, it actually gave a perfect agreement. And we would like to add the third part of the triad, which is theory. So these equations are nonlinear, BVP. There's no known analytical solution even for the simple geometry which you see here. But actually, there's a host of perturbative techniques and expansions that you can use. And actually, every single image here, you could use a different analytical technique. So it's a very nice playground that we can follow. It's good for research. It's also good for teaching. Actually, I learned about boundary layers by working on this problem. And so I'm not going to give the details, but typically you can find planar nonlinear solutions for the case C. You can analyze the transition from planar to non-planar by linear bifurcation analysis from C to D. You can use different kinds of asymptotic expansions to study D or E, because the helices are localized at one end. So it's really a really nice playground. And we end up making reasonably simple predictions shown in the purple curve on the right that match reasonably well with the simulations based on these approximate techniques.
So, okay, so maybe we can go through today's menu and see what we'll be looking at. So we've briefly looked at a case study for hair. Now I'm going to ask Basile to take us through Kirchhoff rod theory, and that'll transition to discussing how we discretize it with discrete elastic rod simulations. And then we're going to start talking about the kinds of experiments that have been done in the lab with elastic rods. After that, we'll start looking at some case study and application problems, coiling on a substrate, biological problem, buckling of a flagellum, And then we're going to start talking about how to scale up, kind of make life more difficult or more challenging for us. So how to consider complex contact, really tight contact, and contact surfaces as in physical knots, wet rods and elastocapillarity, and interesting and unusual cross sections for a rod in a dimensionally reduced manner before wrapping up. So that's going to be today's menu, and I guess we should dive right in.
Very good. Yes, and so to demonstrate that this is not a talk given by artificial intelligence, imperfections show that we have reality. So this video should have actually have come before the outline.
But we can actually make it work here in a different way. It was going to come earlier to show yet another approach on another take on hair, but it can also be used as a nice segue to the Kirchhoff rod theory. So what we're showing here is that we developed a method based on Kirchhoff rod theory for simulating tens of thousands of curly hairs in frictional contact with each other. The contact aspect was a collaboration with Disney and Weta Digital. Weta Digital is the studio that made The Hobbit, for example. And what we're showing is a running scene here, the characters provided by the studios, and it's slowed down to a quarter speed. And the number of hairs that are being rendered is closer to 100,000. So we simulate over 10,000, but then they render even more. And this took about 17 hours to simulate. And one of the things that's important to see here is that the shape of each strand is not just naturally straight. They are naturally curved and helical or in interesting shapes, and that the contact brings these strands together to form locks and other interesting structures. So to really understand how we got to simulation like this, hopefully by the end of this talk you have a sense about this, we need to start from the real beginning, which is Kirchhoff rod theory. So Basile, take it away.
Thanks, Eitan. So the building block for the whole talk is these equations that describe 1D slender objects, and they can be justified from 3D elasticity, and that has been known for quite some time. But in the 1D setting, which you get at the end, the main variables are the centerline position R and the set of three vectors, D1, D2, D3, that capture the orientation of the cross section. So this set of vectors are actually orthonormal, and also the tangent to the curve R prime has to be aligned with one of the directors D3, and it's this kind of constraint formulation which is not very convenient to implement in finite elements, and it's actually the finite elements of rods is surprisingly complicated. Next. Based on the frame, we take the gradient of the rotation, which is called the Darboux vector, and we project the Darboux vector on the frame itself. The two components that are on the cross-section, omega-1 and omega-2, define the curvature of the rod, and the third component along the tangent, omega-3, captures the twist. These are the three strain quantities, or four if you add the longitudinal strain epsilon. So these are the strain components that we use in the strain energy, and the strain energy can be as simple as the one shown on the right. We typically would use a linear strain energy, so a quadratic strain energy for a small strain in the framework of linear elasticity. But you could add nonlinearity, or you could modify the terms to capture the natural curvature that Eitan was mentioning before. So typically,
Go ahead.
Typically, the elastic model is linear, so quadratic energy. But there's this nonlinearity, which is highlighted by the red boxes that comes from the geometry. And there are three types of nonlinearity that come into play here.
So before going on to the next slide, maybe I should just say, if you go back just for a second, Pedro, when Basile explained this theory to me, and he probably had to explain it over and over and over and over again for my little computer graphics brain. One of the things that really was incredibly puzzling to me was, where does the coupling occur between these material directors and the centerline position? Surely the material directors are adapted So the tangent of the material director has to coincide with the centerline tangent. But beyond that, it was hard to see how is it that when you rotate the material directors, this causes any change of centerline position or vice versa. So actually, let's look at a problem that really drives this home on the next slide. Here, there's an elastic rod. It doesn't matter if it's a flat or a circular cross section for what I'm trying to argue right now. What matters is that the endpoint positions are prescribed and that the frames at the endpoints are prescribed and that one of the frames is being rotated. And as that frame at the material frame at the endpoint is being rotated, the center line moves and forms a helical shape. And for me, as someone who's trying to always, be driven by the geometry, the question is, what is the underlying geometry that makes the center line move when we rotate the material frame? And I want to be able to better explore that geometric reasoning with you. So next slide, please. We're going to use orange and blue to depict the orientation of the material frame. And here you can see that the material frame has twist because as we traverse, if we think of it as a traversal from one end of the center line to the other, we see this spinning of the frame around the center line. And that's the key indicator that there's twist. In fact, when we travel along any curved center line, if the material frame is adapted, it has to rotate by some amount simply for the tangents to line up. But this frame is seemingly rotating more than it needs to. And that excess rotation is precisely the twist. So that leads to the question, which actually Basile and Pedro and Max Verdetsky and I and our collaborators first encountered when we read a paper by Langer and Singer. And the question was, let's talk about the least amount of twist that is possible, this kind of minimal twisting frame. They didn't introduce the idea. That's where we learned the idea from them. So here I'm going to use black and white to plot a different kind of frame. This is going to be called a parallel or natural frame. And this frame is defined by an initial value problem. You start at one end of the rod, and as you travel, you always rotate the frame just enough to remain adapted, but no more than that. So always really the minimal rotation. And that's called parallel or natural traversal. You can see now that there's no spin about the center line. And in fact, this is a twist-free frame by definition. So a parallel transport captures this notion of zero twist. And so if you now compare the black and white frame to the blue and orange frame, in fact, the rate of rotation of the blue and orange frame relative to the black and white frame is the twist. So the twist-free frame provides our zero twist frame of reference for measuring twist. So if we recap this for a second, the blue and orange frame is the physical frame, which is the material frame, and it encodes the actual configuration of the rod. And it's defined everywhere along the rod. Whereas a parallel frame is a conceptual frame defined by an initial value problem from one end of the rod to the other, and it encodes the twist-free configuration. Let's go to the next slide for a sec. Let's explore this initial value problem aspect a little bit more. Here is a straight line, center line, and I parallel transport from one end to the other. And now let's introduce a helical perturbation in the middle of the center line and parallel transport again. And crucially, what we get is that on the right side, after the perturbation is traversed, the frames are in a different orientation. You should be able to see that highlighted if you press a button again. And really that's the crux of it, is that the shape of the center line affects what is the definition of the twist-free frame, because the shape of the center line affects parallel transport, because the shape of the center line affects what is the least amount of rotation I need to remain adapted. To really drive this home, here's one more animation where I'm now adjusting the shape of the center line. And as I do this, I keep rerunning the initial value problem, and I'm only showing you the solution of it. So you can see that as the center line adjusts, the definition of the zero twist-free frame must change. And again, I just want to say, and you can bring this up now, Pedro, that I personally first encountered this kind of argument in the papers of Langer and Singer. And that's really when it fully sunk in how important is parallel transport to this whole enterprise. So Basile, maybe using this kind of ideas, you can go back and revisit the problem we set up at the beginning.
Okay, so the classical problem of the helical twisting is shown here in a slightly simpler setting where we start from a straight rod. So remember that the ends are held fixed and twisted, and it's known that depending on the ratio of the twisting moment and of the pulling force, this system can have two configurations: one where it stays straight, and the other one where it buckles into a helical shape. And we're going to show now that these properties of parallel transport and how parallel transport can induce a global rotation with locally zero twist are actually at the source of this instability. So the key observation is that the system can accommodate the imposed rotations at the end in essentially two different ways. So one is shown in the movie on the left, where we assume that the center line remains straight, so parallel transport is identity. The natural frame is constant, and to be able to match the imposed rotation on the ends, we have to twist the material frame shown in colors relative to the natural frame. And as Eitan just said, this is twist. So this configuration has zero bending energy, but it has some twisting energy. On the other hand, another possible configuration is to make the center line helical. And here we show an extreme example where the helicity is such that parallel transport just matches the imposed rotations with rotation at the ends. And in that case, we can just define the material frame to match exactly the natural frame. And by definition, this means that there's no twist. So there's no twisting energy. And of course, there's bending energy because the center line is now curved. So the helical instability is really a competition between these two types of configurations. And by going helical, what the rod is really doing is making use of parallel transport to decrease its twisting energy, because it's transferring part of the imposed angle of rotation onto parallel transport. So even though I was familiar with the Kirchhoff rod model and at the point that I could explain it to it, and I realized that I had not fully understood it by this time. And it's only by digging the problem of parallel transport with Eitan, Max, and the younger people in the team that I started to really understand this instability, and that made me actually realize that you cannot fully understand a model until you're able to simulate it, and the type of methods, of numerical methods that I learned from Eitan are perfect for that.
And so speaking of the younger people in the team, this was Miklos Bergu and later Etienne Vuga. Etienne is now a professor at UT Austin. And what they developed in collaboration with us is a discrete analog of this whole story. So instead of smooth parallel transport along smooth framed curves, we now have discrete parallel transport along discrete framed curves. And once you have discrete parallel transport on discrete framed curves, you can build up all of the kinematics of elastic rods, again, in the discrete setting, now with one material director per edge, and the definition of twist as you would expect, and curvature as you would expect, and so forth. The only thing I really want to drive in this slide is that in this geometric view of discretization, parallel transport and everything that falls from it is not just defined in the sense of numerical analysis, meaning that as we refine our discrete representation towards a limit curve, we recover the smooth notions. It's also defined for arbitrarily coarse curves in a way that's effective. So we really are performing for an arbitrarily coarse curve the minimal rotation needed to keep the frame adapted as we transition from one edge to the next. So then we carried out some evaluations of this, which
yeah, can I just something, because I think that's a point I didn't realize at the start, because it's not that familiar in our community, that the drawing on the right is not an exaggeration. When the discrete model is properly defined, you can literally run simulations with 2 or 3 vertices, and it surprisingly captures the actual behavior well. Of course, it's not super accurate. And so the discrete model is really full-fledged and completely effective.
Yeah.
So we use a few test cases to validate the discrete method that Eitan just outlined. One of the typical configurations that can be used for this goal is still the twisting of a straight rod, and there's a nonlinear solution that describes the localization of the helical pattern that takes place in the post-Basile regime. So we have this analytical localization solution, which is shown in red, and we run simulations with finer and finer mesh and check that the envelope is correctly captured, both for uniform and non-uniform meshes. Another setting which we can use for validation is the classical instability of a twisted ring, which is demonstrated in the movie on the bottom. So if you release a ring which is that has initially some twist angle, captured in it, depending on the amount of twisting and the elastic moduli, it can jump to this figure of 8 shape. And there's an analytical prediction for where this transition appears based on the linear bifurcation analysis. And here we compare the predictions of the numerics in dots and the analytical prediction in the black curve. So everything works, and we can proceed to actually using the method.
So today we're going to focus on talking about scientific applications, but it's useful just as a very quick reminder to say that this was also developed with an eye towards computer graphics. So if you open up Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator, they have physics-based paintbrushes that run in real time that are based on this model. And those, again, like Basile mentioned, only use a few vertices and a few edges per bristle, but they get the qualitative look just right. And then if we go to the next slide, if you can also do more complex animations with this. For example, in Disney's Moana, they built a hair simulation system in-house that was based on some of the ideas from discrete elastic rods and used it to simulate the curly hair in their characters. So that's kind of all in the virtual world, but at the same time that all of this was happening, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there were actual people in the lab working in the physical world.
Okay, so I guess no one will disagree that even if you can run a simulation, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand the intricate ingredients and how they come into play. And so for that, doing experiments where we can also control some of the parameters is very important. And so already for some years now, and so these are some papers about 7 years ago or so, where we reported these protocols, we came up with a very simple but powerful way of fabricating these rods, which we do by casting. So we use these elastomeric silicon polymers in a liquid state that we inject into tubes. And once the polymer cures, we then rip out the outer tube and we end up with a rod. And this is powerful, because of course, being an elastomer, we try to keep the material component as simple as possible. And this is relevant since material strains are typically very low in these systems and the large deformations. But also we can form the tube with a particular shape. And when the polymer cures, the rod that we produce will have that shape. And this is very nice, for example, to induce natural curvature and to study the effect of natural curvature on the rod, as you saw in the hair example. And we've done and used this protocol on a number of projects. Now, a more recent tool in our lab is the usage of X-ray microcomputer tomography. And what that allows is through volumetric imaging to obtain these geometric quantities, these Darboux vectors, the evolution of the directors along the center line of the rod, and we can extract that from experiments, and that we've been very excited about over the past year or so since we got this machine. So let me give you some examples, but before of the usage of this technique. But before, let me share some tricks that are required for these rods to be visible in the X-ray. So first of all, we fabricate the rods by casting, as I said. And so then what we do, we're actually able to embed a fiber inside the rod that is also done by casting. So initially we have a very thin 19-hole rod that we pull out, and then that leaves a channel that we inject back with a polymer. And this polymer has a density that is 15% higher than the rest of the bulk of the rod, but very similar material properties. And that in the X-ray will show as a density gradient that we can then extract. Now, we have been studying problems where contact between rods is important. And so similarly, if you just have a rod of the same material touching another rod of the same material, you have no density gradient, so that won't show up in the X-ray. And so a very nice technique that Paul Jochans, a PhD student in my lab, came up with was to using this same polymer that I mentioned earlier that is 15% denser than so that is 15% denser than the bulk, and the outer coating is also 15% denser than the bulk. And we do that using a Landau-Levitch coating technique. So we pull a rod out of a liquid bath of this denser polymer, and once it cures, this is what the cross-section looks like. So let me show you some examples of this technique. So this is a tomographic scan, okay? So it looks in 3D, but we could have also gotten that through other 3D profilometry techniques. But what's very nice with the X-ray imaging is that we can actually see through the rod. And so here what you're seeing is actually both the outer coating that has a transparency layer just for imaging and this thin rod that is off-center that allows us to quantify the material frame. So now we're not talking about computer animations, we're talking about experimental data. And so this is experimental post-processed data of a figure of 8 knot, where I show the geometric information that we can extract. So you have your directors, the D1, D2, and D3 with these colored vectors. And in addition, because of this coating technique, we can extract the area of contact, the geometry of the contact regions, and this has been keeping us busy on a number of projects. And I should really credit Paul Jochans, Tomohiko Sano, and Paul Grandgeorges, who developed this amazing technique over the past year or so. So thus far, we've mostly given you some of the background, and now in the remaining time, we want to go through a series of examples just to illustrate what we're using all of these toolbox for to solve specific problems, okay? And so we'll start with this problem of coiling onto a substrate. And here, first I want to thank the NSF, and Glaucio Paulino is in the panel right now. So this is a grant that Eitan and I got in 2010. It was a collaborative grant to really bring these things together. And it was really the engine behind a lot of the projects that ensued in this collaboration. So thank you, NSF, thank you, Glaucio, who was the program manager at the time. And so this is what we did. Okay, so this problem is inspired by the Pluto operation. So Pluto was a highly classified operation during the Second World War to essentially lay down pipes from the UK to France to be able to provide fuel to the Allies during D-Day, okay? And so this is a very nice video from the time that shows the pipes, the very long steel pipes that were used, kilometer-long pipes. And here the gentleman in the video is just moving one pipe from high up to low down. And you see how smoothly and almost elastically, nearly elastic it propagates. And this is the kind of vessel that was used for the deployment. Of course, this is not old news. So we depend on the internet these days. We're giving this webinar precisely through information propagating through these cables that are deployed across the oceans. And so very much the same problem is at play here. And this is an example of the type of vessels that are used. Okay, so by now you're starting to get an idea for the PDEs that we perform. So these precision desktop experiments where we're really trying to reduce the problem to the bare essentials. And so what we're going to do, we're going to deploy a thin rod onto a substrate. The deployment is equivalent to the deployment of the cable or the pipeline going from the boat, and the moving conveyor belt is essentially a representative of the boat translating across the surface of the ocean. Okay, and so as you vary the mismatch in speed between deployment, V inject, and the speed of the belt, you can excite different patterns. Of course, if the speeds are exactly the same, you deploy into a straight line. Whereas if you start deploying faster than the conveyor belt can convey, you excite these patterns. You can excite sine waves, alternating loops, meandering on the same side. And so these are experiments done by Khalid Jawed, who's now at UCLA. And so as a result of this collaborative project, Feng Dao, who was a student of Eitan at the time, implemented the discrete elastic rods, the DER code that Eitan was presenting earlier, into the exact same configuration. No fitting parameters, everything is measured independently, and you get representative videos that are essentially indistinguishable from the experimental videos.
I like to say that the videos on the top are very realistic.
You like the experiments because they look very realistic, right? That's now, of course, it's not just computer graphics tricks, and we do quantify and measure things in detail. And just to give you one example, we've measured many other things, and we fully characterize the phase diagram and the within the parameter space. And so here we are plotting the amplitude of the meandering mode, the sinusoidal mode, as a function of this mismatch of speeds between injection and the conveyor belt. So you can change parameters, get different amplitudes depending on this mismatch. The data points are experiments, dashed lines are simulations, no fitting parameters, and so you can really have a powerful predictive tool at hand. So that was the elastic case, and moving on to honey now.
Yeah, so that's essentially the viscous case, which has been studied by fluid mechanicians actually much earlier, much before. And they noticed that by pouring some kind of honey or viscous syrup onto a moving belt, you can tune the patterns by changing the velocity of the belt. So the belt is decreasing. The first straight pattern that you saw was for large velocity. And when the velocity decreases, you transition to these meandering patterns. And I should say that the experiments have been initiated by Keith Moffat and then done systematically by Morris, Stu Webster, Lister, and Neil Rybee. And then you see another transition here where you go to alternated coils. So one coil on one side alternating. So the belt speed is still progressively going down. And then I think pretty soon there's a transient now where, whoops, it's hesitating a little bit. And now it starts to be coiling always on the same side. So I call that regular coiling. So that's really the viscous analog of the deposition that Pedro was showing. And it's been nicely dubbed as the fluid mechanical sewing machine because you can tune the stitching patterns by changing the velocity. You can also tune the patterns by changing the height of fall, and you get all these crazy and very intriguing patterns there. Next, Pedro. So I'm going to skip very quickly, but just in words, there's a deep and beautiful analogy between elasticity and viscous flows. That's called the Rayleigh-Stokes analogy, where in the elastic case, the internal stress is proportional to the strain, while in the viscous case, the internal stress is proportional to the rate of strain. So that's very well known. It has a practical consequence, is that there's a numerical trick where we can just with 3 lines of code use the discrete elastic rod model to simulate viscous threads. So I'm not going to give much more details about that. But essentially, at every time step, we produce in the computer a virtual rod that has a specific reference shape, and we query the elastic forces from this virtual elastic rod to actually compute the viscous stress. Next, please. So we've set up viscous thread simulations by a numerical method based on discrete elastic rods, and we use an analytical solution for steady coiling on a fixed surface by Neil Rybee to validate the code. So Neil's prediction works in the co-rotating frame where the flow is actually steady and corresponds to the black curve here. So there are many limit points. So you see that for some value of the height on the x-axis, there are competing solutions corresponding to different radii. So let's see what the simulation looks when we pour in the computer the honey and slowly raise the nozzle. So we are actually going up on the curve here from essentially A to C. So you see that the radius is slowly increasing as predicted by the curve. And then right here, you see that there's been a transition. The radius suddenly goes down. This corresponds to jumping to the other branch of the curve, then up again slowly, and then another accident where the radius decreases. So that's a almost perfect match between the simulations in orange, yellow, and the analytical reference curve, well, the semi-analytical reference curve. So now we can redo the same simulations, but on a moving belt to mimic what's done in the experiments. And we produce patterns numerically. Next, Pedro. And if we do that in a more controlled way, so here we repeat the same experiments as I was showing before. The belt is slowing down. We start with the meanders. So on the right, you have the phase diagram, and you have this tiny orange arrow that goes down, which shows that the velocity is decreasing. So we went from the blue to the green region, and we had a transition on the left between the meanders to the alternated coils. And now we are entering the red region in the phase diagram, which corresponds to coils. So everything well, qualitatively seems to match. And if you do this more quantitatively and compare the phase diagrams between the experiments in the inset and the numerical simulations in the background, so the big stripes are the data from the numerical simulations obtained by numerical post-processing, and that's the work of Pierre-Thomas Brun's PhD. Then you have a very good match on the regions. So these complex patterns, at the end of the day, just can be fully predicted by the simple viscous fluid combined with nonlinear geometry from rod theory, including some of the very complex patterns that you see on the right, which are sometimes chaotic, have a period doubling, and have many features reminiscent of chaos.
Okay, so Basile was telling you about viscous threads, and now I'm going to take a slight twist, and I'll be talking about threads or rods in viscous fluids. And so this is relevant, for example, for the locomotion of bacteria. So here I'm showing you the example of a micrograph on the root of Roma Stocker, a TTH of Vibrio that has a single helical flagella, and how this slender, long, and flexible helical flagella interacts with the fluid is important for locomotion, as I just said. And you can clearly see in this video by Howard Berg that the flagellas are flexible in their coupling with the fluid flow. So I don't want to spend too much time on details. I just want to point out that we have extended so we've performed precision experiments in a scaled environment where all the appropriate dimensional parameters are preserved. And we have extended, in collaboration with Eitan, the DR code that we've been talking about for a few slides now, with a body force that represents a well-established body force that represents the fluid loading. So this is called Light-Hill-Sender body theory, that not only has a local term through the interaction with the fluid, but also a non-local term. And this is important for flexible structures interacting in a fluid that undergo large deformations, because even though 2 points might be far away in arc length, when they buckle, they might come closer together and interact hydrodynamically. And that's what this red term is doing. Now, again, parameters measured independently. We perform the experiments, we run the simulations, and we get qualitatively very similar behavior. So we can really reproduce the dynamics of the system. And here we are rotating this helical flagella high enough such that the buckling instability occurs. We can quantify the onset of buckling. So for example, if I track the height of the helix as a function and I increase the angular velocity, I wait for a steady state if it's there, and you see that an unbuckled state is present for all of these range of angular velocities, and at some point buckling occurs, and we've quantified what is the ensuing propulsive force that results from this system. But what I want to highlight here is that if I play this video again, we didn't take into account any contact. So we were interested in the onset of buckling of this flagella, but in the post-buckling regime, when self-contact might occur, we just neglected. So the video, even though it looks okay, it's no longer high fidelity of the experimental system. And so if we go along now the theme of contact, Eitan.
So I think, Pedro, looking at the clock, we have maybe about 10, 15 minutes for the formal talk, if I understand correctly. So I think I'll present one slide on contact because I'd like us to have time to see the work on knots. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So you can just play this movie. This is a simulation we did. We thought we were done with discrete elastic rods. We thought it was done and working. But nobody could use it because rods that are not coming into contact with each other are less interesting for simulating hair. A lot of the structures that we see In hair, the reason we have a bad hair day, the reason it's hard work to comb our hair is because of all the frictional contact. So I won't go into all the details of frictional contact today, but I'll just give you 2 points on just staying on this slide. One of them is when you have a lot of hairs and they're very thin, it's hard to track once hairs go through each other, how to untangle that, how to go back. So that makes the simulation code tricky to write. And the best way to do it is to guarantee that they never go through each other, but providing such guarantees is difficult. The other thing that I want to say is that one of the geometric nonlinearities that arises from slender structures is particularly exacerbated for contact. And this is the fact that contact forces are typically transversal to the center line, normal to the center line, which is exactly the direction where if you do an asymptotic expansion, it's hardest to predict the increase in stretching force, which is of course the stiffest force of all of the forces inside the elastic rod. So you have this direction in which it's numerically hard to predict what's happening with the force, and it happens to be the stiffest force, and that makes the numerics very difficult. So that's about the simulation of contact. Now, what happens when you start forming really, really tight contact, really tight knots?
Okay, so then contact is, so let me just go through these slides. Yeah, so contact can make you leave, and so this is an example of a climber who's going to take a fall, and the fall is held by a double figure of 8 knot that the climber has attached to the harness, and it's incredible that I climb and I put so much trust on such a structure, even though we understand it so little. Knots are also very important in surgery. So this is an example of a series of knots that are widely used in surgery. And likewise, we put a lot of trust into these structures that we hardly understand. So one thing that we have noticed in these various knots is a repeating unit, which are 2 rods in contact. And so the question is, how are our forces transferred across this contact region? Learned then about the more details of the system from John Maddocks and his collaborators, and we went away and did some experiments. So here is experimental data of 2 rods in contact. So as you might expect, there is a surface of contact between the two. We can then go away and do finite element computations for quantifying further these contacts, and we can superpose geometric predictions from the applied mathematics community. So here, the red line, that is essentially the contact set for 2 geometric tubes. So no bending stiffness, no deformation of the cross section, no stretching. And instead of a surface, you have this diamond shaped line if you more or less look from above, okay? And so we've been, so the contact is highly non-trivial. If you look at the contact pressure, so the normal tractions in the contact region, you get this heat map with 4 hot zones. And what has been striking to us is that the solution computed by John Maddocks here, the black line, actually follows the ridge of this 4 mountain range. And we've been looking at these non-trivialities in a bit more detail. But for now, all I want to convey is that when 2 rods become in contact, these Kirchhoff-like descriptions fail, and there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more food on the table to digest.
Okay, so I think I'm going to skip this part, which is some work we did with initially with Sebastian Kirch and then with Pedro on analysis of knots, and we work in a situation where the tension force on the knot is very small, and the rod is, the material is very stiff, so we have a big loop, and in that case we can match the symptotic solutions by solving the different parts independently with different approximations and bringing everything together. So yeah, let's skip that, and I'll save my time for the last 2 slides. And that's an extension we did with Pedro for knots that are higher order and where friction plays an important role, and it's a slightly different theory from the first one that is more nonlinear.
And so here in this example, you see that it's a higher than knot with a lot of contact points, but this braid is still helical, and that's what allowed Basile to come up with an analytical solution for this problem. Now, when you go to different kinds of knots, and this is work by Tomohiko Sano here in the group, the clove hitch knot is widely used for attaching ropes to rigid posts. And so here the contact is a lot more complex in these regions of contact and self-contact. And so we've been exploring this experimentally. This is a micro CT scan. Similarly, we can extract this geometric information that we've been talking about before. So here we can no longer use DER because you have all these additional physics at the contact regions and deformation of the cross section and so on. So we have to do full-blown 3D finite element. Tying these knots in finite element wasn't trivial. And so here, the group, Changia Bayek did quite a bit of work. And so now here I'm showing you the three components of the Darboux vector that Basile was describing. Dots are experiments, solid lines are FEM. And so we really have an excellent agreement that allows us to then go into the FEM and investigate quantities that we don't have in the experiment. So for example, here I'm showing the tension as a function of the arc length. So the tension along the rod as I go along the arc length from the region of high tension to the region of zero tension, which is how a knot of this kind works. And you see these exponential regions, which are essentially capstan-like, and you see regions of drop of force, which are in the process of trying to rationalize how really this pinching leads to the loss of tension. Okay, so that was contact, and now a different kind of coupling, Eitan.
Yeah, so we can move from frictional contact to elastocapillarity. So on the left, we have a simulation, and on the right, we have the experiments of Jose Bica and collaborators. And as we drain the water away, some of the liquid is clinging to the rods, and that leads to cohesive forces, and you get these characteristic tree-like structures. Next slide.
Are you there, Eitan?
Looks like it's frozen.
Okay, seems like we lost Eitan.
Somebody leap in and take over.
Well, actually, we could skip the. How much time do we have, John?
Have a couple of minutes, right?
What?
Okay, so it seems like we lost Eitan, but he has a very nice framework of doing these elastocapillary interaction simulations that are physically based, and they can reproduce these incredible video animations. This technology has been used in a variety of movies, and here is just an example. And then it can do crazy things that are incredibly realistic, as this video is showing. Okay, so we should really be wrapping up. So I'll just show you. Basile, do you want to say a couple of words?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of words very quickly on these two slides. So we've been talking mostly about pushing the limits of Kirchhoff rods, having strong loads or stiff loads and these kind of things. But there's another direction which I'd like to mention shortly, which is challenging to the typical rod theory, which is representing these very nonlinear, very soft and large strain structures. So recently we came up with a general reduction strategy with Claire Lestringant that basically starts from any a structural model like a plate, a shell, or even a 3D material for anything that looks like a slender object from far, and produces a 1D model that has nice properties because it's consistent with the Kirchhoff equations in the limit of small strain. It has asymptotically, it's asymptotically exact when everything is slowly varying along the axis, which is what you would typically require to be able to do dimension reduction. And also it handles finite strain, pre-stress, and also the gradient effect. So I've already mentioned the cylindrical balloon problem, which produces results virtually indistinguishable from the full membrane model that were used in previous work. Next. Okay. And the same method can be applied to different problems. So on top, this is the elastocapillary necking. It's a very nice set of experiments done by Serge Morin in Montpellier, where he has very soft shells that are immersed in a solvent And the gels are so soft that surface tension is able to collapse the gels onto themselves. So it's a problem very similar to necking, or which is usually driven by plasticity, but this one is an elastic necking that's reversible. And so we can do a 1D model that does that, and the 1D model just works exactly, produces exactly the same result as the full FEM simulations based on finite 3D elasticity. Another type of problems that we want to tackle that are not initially included in Kirchhoff theory is the case of slender bodies that have a very highly deformable cross-section, because essentially the classical derivation of Kirchhoff assumes that the cross-section is rigid. So if you take an elastic strip, for instance, and I did with my son some experiments during the lockdown on the lateral torsional buckling of elastic strips, it's very simple, and we got surprising results that show that the existing models for strip are not accurate and not applicable because the residual extension matters. So you can apply the general strategy, come up with a more nonlinear equivalent rod model that's outlined here, and that's work in progress. But I really want to make the point that the theory is not there's work to be done left, and there are lots of interesting problems where you go beyond the assumptions that were used in the original theory, and many things remain to be discovered.
Okay, before we get in trouble with John Maddocks, let's wrap up. So I hope that through this talk, and I don't know if Eitan, I think Eitan might be back.
I'm back.
Eitan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm back.
Yes. Do you want to conclude?
Yeah, I can't see the slides yet, so maybe you'll have to do that.
So I hope that through this presentation, maybe as a meta story throughout, that you enjoy the sharing, the fun of collaboration, of course, the power of it in coming up with a multidisciplinary work. Geometry was really the glue on all of these problems. And so really what a lot of the examples we showed you are conveying is the pushing of the limits of rod theory. For example, regarding loading, contact, friction, structure interactions.
Deformable cross sections, as I have just mentioned.
So also on experimental techniques, so there's plenty of new things to do. So I give you an example of X-ray and micro CT imaging.
And the large ensemble of interacting rods, like for hair and such problems.
And together, when we're pushing the limits of rod theory, we're fondly calling this extreme rods.
Very good.
I think that's the punchline. So we all now have to clap. Except if you're on mute.
Very good. Okay, so shall I stop sharing my slides? Or
yes, please.
Okay.
All right.
Very good. So now, I guess I'm in charge of selecting questions. And this is experimental because I've never done it before, and I need help. So now we're waiting for somebody to click on a put your hand up button and ask questions.
Claudio already.
Thank you.
New hand.
Thank you. I was motivated by the closure, extreme rods. And my question then is about extreme environments. So everything that you showed, the rods that are here on Earth, what about, and this question is for the three of you, what about if we are in a different planet, where you have, the planet has a magnetic field, and the planet has lots of rods that are magnetized in different directions, and some are weakly magnetized and some are strongly magnetized, and you have very tiny rods from the micro nano scale to very large rods. How would be the environment in this planet?
Okay, so Claudio, did you coordinate this question before the talk with Pedro? Because I know he has the answer.
No, I never talked to Pedro about this. No.
Okay. So the trivial answer, of course, is gravity is the only one changing. We covered. That's fine. Kirchhoff has been around for a long time, and that works. So it's one of those. Thanks for your question, Glaucio. So for magnetic rods, Tomohiko Sano, who should be on the talk, has done just that in the process of writing the paper. And what he's done is he has followed the dimensional reduction framework that Basile was presenting. So you start with an elastic energy. In this case, you add a magnetic energy term to the functional. And the energy has actually been well established recently by Nick Trentafilidis and by Xuan Hezao, Sean Chester. So we've just taken their functional form, make it go through the whole variational principle, and we have derived the magnetic Kirchhoff rod theory in 3D, which we have tested, excellent agreement with experiments. We have an FEM code. We don't have a DR equivalent yet, but so a Kirchhoff rod theory in 3D for magnetic rods, it's coming in cinemas near you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Very good.
But Pedro, what about the scaling? Small rods, micro rods, at the micro level, micro nano level, and big rods. What about the scaling? Can you guys comment on scaling? It has to play because different physics will emerge in different scales. What about the scaling?
Basile and Eitan?
Yeah. So at small scale, there's an abundant literature on effects associated with the fact that the rod is not going to be well described by a continuous, it's not really a continuum, and this kind of thing. So traditionally, people would tend to introduce additional terms, which are the gradient terms. So the energy has to depend, because of the finite scale, on the gradient of curvature and not just on the curvature, for instance. And that's interesting because it's exactly the same type of effect that we are including to represent the transition zones that I showed on the cylindrical balloon. So the mathematical effect is somehow similar to the types of things we already do, and we don't have DER simulations running at the moment, so the discrete elastic rod framework doesn't handle these additional effects, but that's the direction we want to go into.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we have a technical problem because the chairman can't see the raised hands. But the penalty for that is I can start asking the questions until I see a raised hand. But it's interesting, you see, so the name Kossara never appeared anywhere during the lecture. And somehow, we're discussing Kirchhoff rods. Actually, I mean, the whole question of history is an issue. I don't think Kirchhoff ever included any sort of extension, but the Kossara brothers certainly did, right? And somehow there's an issue in what do you mean by a rod theory? And I mean, what you could mean by a rod theory is you describe it by a curve and a frame, right? And after that, all the issues of scale and application are the constitutive relations. And that's where it gets difficult, right? And I mean, Basile at the end was saying at small scale, then it doesn't work so well. I'm not at all sure I agree with that, in fact. I mean, the question is, if you're trying to derive rod theories from three-dimensional elasticity theories, that's a very interesting case, but there's only one case. I mean, you can fit constitutive relations in rod theory to other data, right? Atomistic data, stuff like that. But anyway, right.
John, following up on your comment, and maybe this also links to Glaucio's question, you could tell us a bit about the DNA work that you have done and the usage of rod theories for describing DNA, where lots of other physics come in.
Well, it's true, but then I'm constrained by, as you know, I'm a very modest and shy person, and so I'll only go last. And now I'm seeing a chap that Taher has raised a hand. So is Taher there?
Yes, hi.
There you go.
Yeah, wonderful. Three of you have proved that a trimeter can work in 1 hour. And just a wonderful presentation by three of you. So I have quite a few questions, but I will probably ask if others don't have any questions. towards the end. But one question that I had is, when you talked about the contact and friction, are you also considering the sliding? That may add a dissipative energy loss. And how would that change the predictions? And in experiment, you probably have sliding as well, Pedro, from your experiment. And from simulation, I'm wondering whether that is, how much that matters. And in terms of when the fluid is involved, we know there's a hydrodynamic interaction between the two rods or two hair, if you will. How does that change the behavior when things come very close because of the hydrodynamic interactions? Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to understand the physics. I may not have the answer, but
right. Okay, so maybe there were two questions there for me. So let me try to address maybe the second one. Right. So on the fluid structure interaction problem, we use an extension of Light-Hill slender body theory that doesn't just have the two different drag coefficients that you're familiar with, and we've talked about it related also to your work, Tahir. And there's an additional non-local term that is included and necessary and relevant precisely because when buckling occurs and large deformation might happen, 2 points far away in arc length can come close together. And that is taken into account. And that's why when the thing buckles, you can still reproduce deformations that are representative of what you're seeing in the experiments. Now, when they really come together close to touching, then we don't have, of course, a contact model, and so it's no longer realistic when they close to touching. Or of course, hydrodynamically, there's always going to be a thin layer, so they won't really touch. But yeah, we'll fail at some point. So that was the hydrodynamic question. For the sliding question, so we don't have predictions yet, or at least officially. I might defer the answer to John, but that's actually a very challenging problem. So how do you adapt what I showed you in the static case when one of the rod is sliding, and it's challenging. We're making some progress, but we don't quite have the answer yet. You want to say anything else, John?
John isn't unique. Yeah, me. So
John,
I mean, it's
Maddocks.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting that, well, you mentioned Light-Hill slender theory. There's many slender theories, right? I mean, it's a very active story.
Yeah.
I mean, in Stokes flow, drag is a completely non-local phenomenon, right? So you don't even, I mean, the rods don't even need to get close to each other, right? And so I think it's very challenging to get an accurate model of drag. And it's a very singular limit as the radius goes to 0. In fact, I was quite curious in the spirit of good constructive, but therefore nasty scientific questions. I mean, in Pedro's movie, you had this, I mean, you had many movies where there was incredibly good fit between simulation and experiment. But it seems in the case for the rotating filaments, it looked as though the buckling transition was off by quite a lot, right? Was that right? Or
no. So the onset of buckling is well described by this framework. The configurations in the post-buckling regime, they are qualitatively okay.
Right. But you see, I mean, that could very easily be that maybe the Light-Hill drag model maybe isn't so great. I mean, it's just a hard problem. I'm not sure there are good drag models, right? Although I suspect other people know I mean, a lot more about that. Okay, so now
the post-buckling regime is the flagella is quite chaotic. I would expect that even if you had a perfect model, I would expect that just numerical integration error would lead to different trajectories.
No, that's, well, indeed. I mean, well, yeah, no, sure. So David Welts has been patiently waiting. Is David Welts there with us?
Yes, thank you. So thank you, guys. Very nice talk, very educational. I can't help taking advantage of having such experts around to ask some questions that are important, at least for somebody who does experiments all the time. You know, one of the things you're always trying to do is take something that's a thin rod and try to strengthen it. And so I wonder if you can tell me something about how I can do that. I know two things that I do and that can be done and that you see, for example, in biology a lot. One is you can take rods and put them together. If you just put them parallel to one another and don't have them coupled, it doesn't really strengthen things very much. But if you start coupling them so that when they bend, they can't bend with respect to one another, they can't slide with respect to one another, then it starts becoming a three-dimensional object. So I'd like to know how much you have to couple, how well you have to couple. Can you say anything about that? And as a related thing, I know, for example, I think, Pedro, you showed the time where you fell from while you were climbing, and we know ropes are strengthened always by weaving or rotating them together. So what's the difference between that? Can you tell me anything about how to strengthen things and how to go from one dimension to more like a three-dimensional object or much stronger object?
So maybe multiple questions in there.
I'll make one clarification and then maybe I'll pass it on to Eitan and Basile. So that wasn't me climbing. I don't climb that hard.
He doesn't fall when he climbs.
I don't like falling when climbing. No, I don't climb. No, but seriously. So I think what you're asking, David, is really a question about cables, right? I mean, if you look at steel cables with a very intricate geometry that derive the mechanical performance of steel cables as we have them, even a geometric question there is non-trivial. So Greg Grayson at UMass Amherst has been doing a lot of work on these packings, and my understanding is that is now also started including frictional interactions in between the strands. Don't quote me on these, but these are unsolved problems in terms of packing of filaments. I don't know if Basile and Eitan have.
Well, the basic observation is that just by looking at the expression of the bending modulus, if you combine several beams and make sure that there's little sliding and they stay together, then you increase the bending modulus non-proportionally, right? And that's the basic idea, I think, about twisting.
Can you quantify this little sliding? I mean, if I have a little bit.
That's really difficult. That's why friction is important. That's why you need to wave. So I'm just saying something qualitative. I'm not aware of, I'm aware of several works that went into that direction of trying to derive equivalent properties for woven braids.
Basile,
I think it's an open subject. Yeah.
Basile, maybe do you want to say something about the book problem that we're working on? So it's not a cable. These are not filaments, but pages with interfriction.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, no, go ahead, and I'll pick a book so that I do a demonstration. Since Lalit is here, I'll pick his book from the shelf.
Yeah. Can I make a comment on this?
Sure.
There used to be a engineering community working on, going back to David's question, working on ropes and wires. Actually, in order to generate these wires or ropes, steel ropes, just twisting the individual fibers is not enough. During that process, you have to twist the fibers individually while weaving them together. That gives you the strength. So friction is critical in that case. There was one person, when I joined University of Illinois many years ago, there was a guy by the name of George Castello, was considered the wire rope guy. He wrote a book on that. So this is very engineering the approach. There's a limited understanding of the physics behind it, but they know in order to strengthen it, you have to twist individual wires while weaving them together. And they also observe that when you break these ropes, they unwind themselves, releasing large amount of energy. So much so that there was a 2 million pound machine in the so-called TAM department, Theoretical and Applied Mechanics department at Illinois. And I took our students to watch one of these experiments, steel ropes. When it broke, it untwisting and releasing the energy so much that some of the wires, steel wires, flew around. Actually, I was fortunate that those students were hurt by that process.
So presumably, if you twist them just the right amount, you're increasing the contact forces in the weaving, in the weave itself, right? Because the weave is causing each individual wire to have some kind of three-dimensional, maybe helical configuration. And if you twist in the direction that would enforce the opposite helix, you're kind of doubling the contact force. Something like that, maybe.
And so maybe let me show you a very simple model system where all of these questions are relevant. So this is to address David's question. So if you grab a book, okay, so this is Lalit's book, and you ask, okay, what's the bending stiffness of this book? So you have 500 pages, and you might say, okay, is the bending stiffness of each page multiplied by n, or is n times the thickness multiplied by n cubed, or n times the thickness cubed? Well, that's not the case, because of course you do have sliding, and so clearly somewhere in between. And in describing this problem, so Basile can tell a bit more how to go about the dimensional reduction here, but you have to consider the normal forces that one page is exerting onto the other, and since these solutions are planar, we can use Elastica and to calculate these normal forces. And,
right.
And from that, you can tune the stiffness through the friction. So take, for example, now imagine of taking a book with flat pages. If you have pages that are naturally curved at rest and you make it flat, you're able to change the normal force between the pages. So you'll be able to tune the bending. I mean, I wouldn't call it strength, but the bending stiffness of the book that way. So friction and internal normal forces, that as we were all saying, is certainly one knob to tune mechanical properties of these multi-component filaments.
So I want to rephrase what you've just said, because that was kind of unexpected. So we have this book where friction is important and enters into the global response. So the global response is not an equivalent rod that would either have a complete cross section or just a superposition of different rods. It's more complicated than that, because friction enters into play. And actually, what was surprising to me is that the book you show is not equivalent to a rod, because it's not only about deriving equivalent moduli, because friction is a very strange beast, right? If you just squeeze the book by at some point, then you're enhancing the friction force and you're increasing the equivalent bending modulus. And I mean, if you take a regular rod, you can squeeze the rod; it doesn't change anything. So it led us to a different type of models than just rod, and that was not completely anticipated on my side, because I thought that anything that was slender could be represented by a rod. So in other words, it's a very non-conventional constitutive relation where the internal stress, which usually has no influence on anything, here enters into the equivalent stiffness.
So if I can abuse my role as chairman again, I was very glad that George Costello's book was already mentioned, because actually I own that book. I really thoroughly recommend it. It's a very nice book for people to read about structures. For wire ropes in contact, there's a whole literature. So I don't climb. You might tell if you know how big I am, I don't climb, but I sail. And so they have different structures, like 1 by 19 wire rope is 19 strands altogether. And then, but that's very stiff. It doesn't bend very well. And then there's another one which is 7 by 7. So you have seven coils. I mean, there's a vast amount known practically about how to build these wires. And it's known that some are flexible, some are stronger, whatever. But I think there's very, very little theory. And of course, I mean, so I introduced Pedro as being from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. So in English, that's the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And we have a slightly lesser known sister institution, which is ETHZ. And in fact, in their math department, they used to have display cabinets of all the different metal ropes, because Switzerland's a big expert in this because of mountain railways and mountain cable cars and things like that. But again, we then go back to the friction and the twisting and the counter twisting, and Eitan was saying things like that. I mean, the main thing in rope, in hemp rope and things like that, the fibers are much shorter than the rope, right? So there's no one single fiber which goes the whole length. That's the whole point. Now, metal ropes, that's usually not true. I mean, metal cables, each fiber is as long as the piece of rope. But in natural woven ropes, they had these immensely long buildings where they pre-stressed them and whatever. And it seems as though you need to make a weave where when you pull, you get extra lateral pressure. And I think Joe Keller actually has an article about that, but I can't remember the details of it. But it seems to me there's many, many things to be understood about the detailed structure of multi-stranded rods, ropes, filaments, whatever you want to call them. And there's much practically known, but I don't think there's very much theory. I think George Costello's book is probably the most I know of.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. So now let me go back. I think the next person in the list is Nanshu Liu. Nanshu, are you still with us? Go ahead.
Yes, I really enjoyed this wonderful trio. Thank all the three speakers. I feel it's very interesting that I plan to ask the three gentlemen for some hair care questions and suggestions. Because I have long hairs and I have nowhere to get hair cut during the quarantine. So my hair is growing longer and longer, and then they start to entangle. And the more I brush them, the more entanglement I get. So my question is, first, from like the word expert of rods and fibers, first question is, given the material and interfacial properties, and maybe some initial curvature or maybe no curvature, can you give us a prediction of the critical length beyond which entanglement would occur? Because when my hairs are shorter, I don't have entanglement problem, right? So that's the first suggestion I need. The second suggestion is, when would be the best time to brush my hair to make them like unentangled? Because I know some ladies brush their hairs during the shower, right after they apply the conditioner and wash off the conditioner, then they brush their hairs, and then after shower, their hairs are not entangled. I don't know if that's particularly helpful. And if you have any other hair care suggestions, please share with all of us. Thank you.
Nanshu, I'm sure Pedro can give you all the advice you need.
Okay, so every Monday I put some shaving cream and no, okay, so seriously, I don't feel qualified on the technical front. I mean, so Nanshu, it's a fascinating question. I think it's really a research problem there that should be addressed. And so Maha has recently, I think addressed. I remember seeing a talk at the APS some time ago. So honestly, I can't actually tell you much. We have some industrial contacts where we're trying to address this problem, but I can't really tell you more. Eitan, maybe you have some suggestions.
Well, first of all, I thought that this is a very pertinent question, as Nanshu was saying, because I can't think of a more fair way to prioritize clients for the hair salon once the hair salon's open than by evaluating how close they are to this critical length when the entanglement happens. But I think the simple answer lies more in the knotting part of the talk, which is once your hair is long enough to start to get entangled, it's the time to start knotting it up and arranging it in a way where it doesn't have all that free length to move about. So that would be the kind of the practical hair care answer that I'd say is tied up in one of the various knots that Pedro showed on his slides.
Thank you. And also, you, especially Eitan, showed those capillary effects. So I'm wondering, like, is it better to brush when it's wet or when it's dry?
I think reducing the coefficient of friction is extremely helpful.
Right.
So I think the conditioner and anything that makes it slippery definitely makes it easier. And I can also say that from experience, having tried to brush my daughter's hair when it's wet with conditioner and when it's dry, and she has long curly hair, the conditioner helps a lot. Yeah. The other thing, if you want to be very practical about this, but I do think it's worth saying, is to start by brushing from the end points of the hair and then progressively brush more of the hair rather than starting immediately from the roots and brushing down. Because when one starts from the roots and brushing down, one is essentially acting, the brush is pulling apart hairs, and in doing that, it's essentially tightening the knot that is below.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to work on short pieces so that you're kind of opening the knots. And so you want to work towards the open end, from the first knot closest to the open end out towards the open end.
Right, we kind of learned that in the practical way.
That's right. So, but I think if we were to actually look at this with some of our tools, I think we would find that my conjecture is that it's the difference between tightening the ropes that pull the knot tighter versus putting your finger inside the knot and opening it up. That's my conjecture.
Okay, so now I could maybe inject another remark. I mean, so Pedro was proposing, I mentioned something about, rod models at the molecular level. So I'm not going to do that. But in point of fact, in polymer physics, both for long DNA and say for proteins and other biological filaments, when they're at such a small scale, the solvent has so much energy, they're actually stochastic. So there's a vast literature on the probability of knot formation on stochastic motions, right? And actually, that's actually very interesting. And I think basically the longer it gets, with probability 1, you will not. Right? I mean, that might be pertinent. But anyway, okay, so now I have 2 messages which are clearly referring to the same person with slightly different names. Franz, one is Franz Sparpen, one is Franz Papen. Anyway, Franz, are we there, Franz?
Yes, I am, yeah. Well,
sorry for butchering your name. Yeah. We have a technical problems here, right? So
that's quite okay. I just had another observation on the cable problem that came up earlier. Simply that there is a time-dependent or a kinetic aspect of this that's always fascinated me. That is, if you take a cable and you tighten it up to a certain force and you let it sit, it will relax. And it will relax a lot more than anything you can expect from just the material properties. So this whole frictional problem must have a very interesting kinetic aspect to it as well. So I wanted to get the expert's opinion about this.
No, but I'm sorry, so you're saying if you take a cable and you stretch it,
yep,
then it starts sagging again.
Over time, the force will go down.
So there's a creep.
Again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there must be something to these frictional forces that's kinetic. That is, that as they move, they make the relaxation in other places possible. Has that been investigated systematically? Do we understand something about these relaxation processes?
I can definitively say I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone else know the answer to that?
I don't know the answer to that. Right? So viscoplastic type effects because of the friction interaction across the ensemble. I see it happening, but I don't know of previous literature.
But has it been measured systematically? Are there good measurements on this?
I'm not aware of. I don't know. Basile, Eitan?
No, I don't know either. That's a good question.
Because it seems like a very simple experiment, and that would be good, and certainly of practical use, right?
It's kind of this is the challenge with a lot of these problems, right? So let's really simplify the system. This configuration I showed that we working on with John Maddocks, right? So you have 2 rods and you put them in frictional contact, and you slide one and you ask what is the tension drop across this contact region, right? I mean, it's a two-component system, a supposedly simple contact geometry. Of course, it ends up not being that way. And even that simple problem is extremely challenging, right? So to going from there to an ensemble, I think just using the very mechanistic description, I think we're long away there. So maybe you just need to go at it with a very different kind of tools, maybe statistical physics type tools to describe the statistics of the ensemble. But I don't know. That's the honest answer.
So John,
yes,
Maddocks, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are 4 people who raised their hands.
Sure. So next is Lalit Anand.
Okay.
Actually, people are private messaging me with the names, which is great.
Oh,
so
okay.
that works.
Okay.
So yeah, hi everyone, Pedro and Eitan and Basile, great talk. So my question is, what's beyond elasticity? So we saw the case of the honey and then elastic. So in between, you have many other material type response. And specifically, when do these knots fail, and how is that accounted for, or what are you guys doing about it?
So there's a little bit of literature on 1D models for necking and plastic necking, and John Hutchinson and I have a paper on dimension reduction for viscoplastic necking. So the idea is to use these more complicated material models more complicated than just elastic, and come up with a 1D model. But essentially, it's doing the dimension reduction cleanly in these cases is much harder because the dimension reduction uses the energetic and the minimization structure of the elastic problems all the way, from the start. So essentially, it's a tough and open question. So of course, you have alternative approaches. You can do some assumptions on the kinematics and assume that the cross section just expand or are rigid or whatever. But it's essentially a much harder problem. And as you mentioned, in Knott's problem, we have finite strains, and it's unlikely that the elastic answer is correct all the way.
Maybe let me just add the following, and I'm not sure if Basile and Eitan are aware of these, but it connects to something that you know, Lalit, right? So Khalid Jawed, who was my PhD student at MIT, who's now at UCLA, I believe for your class project in plasticity, it wasn't really work related to my lab, but for his class project in plasticity in your class, he started the early stages of developing a raw theory with plasticity. And he has a paper published this year. I mean, he's really independent. He's taken this on his own with his group, a paper that is DER based, but with internal plastic deformation. I can send you the link later on, but that has formalized, and it has agreement with experiments, and so it's essentially DER with plasticity.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll send you the link, Lalit.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, so the difficulty with plasticity is that there's a history dependence, and the distribution of residual stress and how it deforms really depend on the history, and it's hard to find just a single descriptor that captures the current state, and I mean that's a fundamental difficulty mathematically that's difficult to go around. So I mean, I'd be curious to see what they have in their model.
Maybe I can post it. I can post on the chat and everyone sees it, right? So let me try to find this paper and I'll post it here for everyone.
I'm not sure if I can commit to reading it thoroughly during the chat.
We're going to ask you about page 3 in 10 minutes. Right. But so one of the interesting things about knot theory, of course, is they've been around for thousands of years, and there's lots of practical knowledge about it. So for example, one of the big dangers actually in tugboats, like pulling large ships, is if the cable breaks, it flies around and it can do a lot of damage, including killing people. So they nearly always, they tie a knot in any towing cable so that they know that will be the weakest point in the cable. And when it breaks, it will break at the knot, right? And it's probably because there's very high curvatures, there's some kind of shear stresses, it induces failure of the elastic material. And as a practical matter, that's really known. I think there's less theoretically known about it. Actually, one of Pedro and my colleagues, Giovanni Dietler, did experiments on breaking spaghetti. And again, you know, somehow they say inside a knot, you can get very high shear forces due to the interaction. And then the thought is that's probably where the failure will happen. I think that's not far from clear. If we're done with that topic, the next person in the queue is Catherine Ding. Catherine Ding is there?
Yeah. Hi.
Great.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a graduate student at Harvard. Thank you very much for the fantastic talk. And it's really exciting to see all the authors of the papers I've been reading in my literature review, like vivid on the screen. I have some technical questions, one from mechanics point of view and one from the simulation point of view. So I guess I will start with my mechanics question. It is related with, I guess, Dave's question before, when we have like yarns that are spun together, or like in the techniques when we are making them, they have that nonlinearity of the yarn at the yarn level, like one single fiber level. But also, I guess when we are weaving them together, or when we're knitting them into like a fabric, into like a 2D material, they also have that structural nonlinearity, like a nonlinearity of their stress strain response from structure dominating region to material property dominating region. So I was wondering, have you encountered such an example, and how much can we quantify the kind of effect from the material nonlinearity at the yarn level?
Who'd like to answer that amongst the authors?
I designate Basile.
No, did you mean, what kind of nonlinearity are you referring to? Contact or?
I guess it's like, it's when we're doing like experiment measurement at one single yarn, it has that nonlinear stress strain response. But then also when we are making them into like a 2D sheet kind of structures, like a weaved pattern or knitted pattern, they also have that nonlinear response. Then how can we, but then if say our focus is to address the nonlinearity at the 2D level, then how can we really kind of reduce the effect, or like say, reduce the effect from the single yarn level, that kind of nonlinearity, because of the technique that thing is made?
Maybe let me try to say it in a different way. When you have large curvature, you have geometrical nonlinearity. That's one aspect. When you have interaction of the fibers, you have friction. That's another nonlinearity. That's probably at the material level. Is that what you're trying to ask, Catherine?
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe I'll have a go, Catherine. So I think it's a very good question. So for the non-elastic behavior, it comes back to the previous questions of how to add plasticity, or if you have multiple filaments, frictional interactions. And as we said earlier, it's challenging. I think there's some work out there. There's some work to be done at the single fiber level. So maybe if you allow me to rephrase your question a little bit. So what if at the material level, it's perfectly elastic, and now you weave or you knit the structure, and you ask what underlies the nonlinear stress strain response of the weave or of the knitting? So there's quite a bit of recent work on that. So maybe a couple of recent studies by Elisabetta Matsumoto at Georgia Tech. So she's done some fantastic work on knitting and building topology into the description of the knit, plus force strain displacements, and also Mohtab Abedia and Samuel Ponclou, who have this very nice paper in PRX from last year or 2 years ago, also on knitting. And so they attribute the geometrical nonlinearities of the single element and how they build up to give you a nonlinear stress strain response. But they don't really consider inelastic aspects into their description, as I understand it.
Thank you. And my second question, I guess, is from the simulation part, which will probably be addressed to Eitan, is that could you please highlight the kind of like advantage of discrete elastic rods method against like other kind of like more like spline interpolation based methods, such as like the use of cubic B-spline functions where they can describe the rods in like a more smooth kind of spatial space. And in simulation, would that kind of like smoother interpolation be more advantage in like points where the contact become tricky when they come too close to each other into the yarn? Or like, could you please highlight like maybe like comparison between the different kind of simulation techniques? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I think they all have their place. I should clarify that when we set out to develop discrete elastic rods, it wasn't because we wanted a particular advantage or because there was a shortcoming of previous methods. It was really just intellectual curiosity coming from the standpoint of wanting to work with discrete systems. So the real philosophy behind discrete elastic rods is how can you distill the most fundamental aspects of the geometry of Kirchhoff rod theory, and in particular parallel transport, into a setting that's geometrically discrete, not just discrete in the sense of finite degrees of freedom, but really discrete in the sense of straight pieces connected by points. In computer graphics, that's very advantageous because so much of the computer graphics community is still thinking in terms of linear finite elements and point mass systems. So they're used to thinking in terms of flat triangles and straight edges and so forth. Of course, in the computer-aided and geometric design community, splines are much more prevalent. In terms of contact, there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of a smooth formulation like a spline formulation is that you have a mathematically principled place to talk about smooth sliding contact. I mean, if your actual objects have some amount of smoothness to them and you want to be able to represent the slowly sliding together that happens when you tighten the knot, having a smooth representation is clearly advantageous because it better captures the underlying thing you're trying to do. The smooth representations, like the spline representations on the other side of the coin, come with some challenges. It's that much more difficult to track what is the pair of closest points, to basically to track the contact surface, because it's a higher order thing. When you try talking about finding the closest point between two straight lines, or track the contact surface between two straight cylinders, it's obviously a simpler problem to pose. So in some sense, coding up the piecewise linear setting may be easier in some sense, and on the other sense, if you really need that extra smoothness, then you need that extra smoothness, and you have to bite the bullet and use a higher order theory. The last thing I would add is that to my knowledge, the discrete elastic theory is one where we don't rely on arbitrarily fine resolutions in order to recover the properties we're looking for. So the parallel transport is described correctly for at the most discrete level, at the coarsest level. I don't see a reason why you could not do that for splines or for other things, where you could define it so that it works for coarse resolutions. But I'm not sure if that's where the focus has been with all of those theories. So that's something I just don't know.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I think it's a very important question because essentially, dealing with high order interpolation is really the philosophy of finite elements. It's been really widespread, and the discrete elastic rods really use a different approach. I think it's important to realize that many things are a lot harder with higher order interpolation, even without contact. So if you take splines, for instance, the condition that the spline is inextensible is not so easy to work out. If you have discrete elastic rods, you will just request that the distance between the nodes is constant. As Eitan said, parallel transport could, in principle, can be set up on the spline, but it's a lot easier to set up just a bit at the joints between two segments. And so it's many things are, in my opinion, significantly harder if you use higher order interpolation. Of course, there are.
I agree with what you say for splines, but Basile, you had a paper with Florence preceding discrete elastic rods where you didn't work with splines, you worked with piecewise helical shapes. And there, your degrees of freedom were the actual strains, right? They were the parameters of the helix. And so their inextensibility, for example, was built in, but you had a smoother representation.
Right, and then when you want, then it becomes non-local degrees of freedom because you use strains. So if you want to go back to the actual node positions, you have to do an integration along the rod. And if you want to calculate the acceleration at a point, it becomes coupled to all the degrees of freedom. So there are other significant disadvantages.
So I think, I mean, actually, this is one of the questions I was going to ask myself. So I think Catherine's question is a very good one. And I think it's very subtle, right? I mean, I don't think, which numerical method or which model is best? Well, so hopefully the answer depends upon the question. And I think it can be quite subtle, you know, if something works and answers your questions and models your data, then why not? But at the very beginning, Basile sort of said that, I'm probably going to get the phrasing right, that, you know, finite elements has had some problems with rod theories. I think that's unfair, right? I mean, I think there's slightly different questions. I mean, so there's the DER model, right? So that's a discrete elastic rod model, but it's actually really a discrete linear elastic rod model. And you could make a discrete model with cubic splines or quadratic splines. I mean, I think there's lots of issues that could be gone into. And for example, I mean, actually, arguably, for computing tight knots, something called biarcs are incredibly good. So biarcs are piecewise circles. I mean, they're also, I mean, they're a limit of, I've forgotten the name of the particular splines, but I think there's really subtle questions, right? And I think there's a question, you know, do you want the model to be intrinsically discrete? If you want the model to be intrinsically discrete, at what level? Should it be a linear model, quadratic model, cubic model? I mean, could be different ways. I mean, one of the things that finite element guys would say is that they always want to study convergence, right? And they always talk about H convergence and P convergence. So that's not Hewlett-Packard. H is the step size and P is the degree of the finite element. And actually, there's sort of a rule of thumb that if the solution is smooth, you should take H very large, very few elements, big long segments, and P very high. I mean, one of the limitations, I would say, of an intrinsically discrete model is I don't see how you do mesh adaptation, because in lots and lots of rod problems, there's, you know, it's a big long thing, and there's places where there's low curvature, and then there's places where there's high curvature. So in good numerics, there's no reason why you have to have the same mesh at different places, right? I mean,
there's no requirement. Just to clarify, there's no requirement in the rod model that the edge lengths are all the same. It doesn't rely on that.
So sure, but then how are you going to adapt it to the solution? I mean, actually,
right. So
I mean, if you have an underlying model, you have to have some sort of quote truth. Yeah. Yeah.
So one way to do this is basically to say that you don't want to undersample the curvature, and so where you have two edges where the angle between them is too great, you bisect those edges. And that essentially just creates new nodes where the thing can bend. And so you limit the amount of angle at each node that is bending. This is just to answer the question of how you do adaptivity for this.
No, sure.
But I actually agree with all the preceding points. I think the simple answer is we looked at building parallel transport in the most discrete possible place, because in some sense, from a mathematical perspective, that's just a curious thing to do, right? What is the most discrete theory you can have? But I did have students who looked a little bit at splines and so forth, and I do think that it would be very interesting to develop higher order versions of this approach, but again, still focused on really getting the parallel transport to be exactly represented over each discrete piece.
Sure. No, I mean, the thing I was trying to say is that I think there's probably no one perfect answer.
No, sure. I think we all agree on that. Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, but it's, well, I mean, certainly for people coming into the field, I mean, there's separate questions. I mean, there's the underlying model, there's how you numerically discretize it, and there's whether you want the underlying model to be discrete or continuous, and there's positives and minuses in all of them. I mean, certainly, I mean, I try and pay attention to lots of simulation about rods. I don't think I've seen anything approaching the number of hairs, right? So one answer is, we can do more hairs than anybody else, and you can do it because it's linear, right? And that's fantastic, right? On the other hand, I'm
not sure, just to clarify, I'm not sure I've convinced myself that the reason we can do more hairs is because it's discrete elastic rods or because it's linear. I mean, I do a lot of other work on contact and frictional contact outside of rods. And so, you know, it's kind of open whether it just happens to be the intersection of two skill sets or something specific about this model. We had this model. This is what we tried it with. It works well, so we kept going with it. But to go beyond that and to say it's better for reasons A, B, or C really isn't genuine to how the model came about. It didn't come about because of trying to address a void or a need in the ability to simulate rods. It came about because of an interest in discrete differential geometry and mechanics and elasticity of slender structures and how to bring those things together.
Well, but so I think we basically agree. But for example, there's now this acronym DER, discrete elastic rod, but shouldn't it really be DLER? Is it discrete?
You have to ask Pedro, because he taught me the acronym. But I mean, I suppose, yes, discrete linear elastic rods. Pedro, update slides.
Well, linear is confusing because it's not about the constitutive law, it's about the geometric order of interpolation, right?
Yeah, as long as the aspect ratio remains small enough, right, you will have small strains throughout the rod. So even if you have a nonlinear material at high strains, it will still just excite the linear regime, right?
I think John is referring to linear in the sense that the model has straight lines connected end to end.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. And then again, it's
maybe
then you have the same word different things.
So since this is really meant to be a conversation, I would like to go back to Catherine. And you saw your question generated a long discussion. I'm actually curious.
Best question yet.
Could you tell us a bit about your work and what you're trying to do with your projects, if you can share? Maybe what motivated the question based on your work, or was it general interest?
It was actually very related to my research work under the supervision of Professor Chris Rycroft and Professor Katya Botodi at Harvard. So we're trying to look at textile-based materials and trying to simulate accurately such that we can hopefully do the inverse problem of designing smart materials based on the deformation and the desired functionality. And these questions were just the kind of questions I had when I was developing this numerical code for the simulation, that I guess I'm just using the opportunity I had today to gain perspectives from experts on the fields. And thank you so much for providing your perspectives. And I have learned a lot.
Thanks, Kathy. Maybe Eitan, could you, on the computer graphics front, right? So fabric and weaved structures, I'm sure they get simulated. What's the state of the art there?
So a good number of papers, the papers that I know on doing mechanical simulation of knitted garments at the yarn level are using discrete elastic rods, and those are papers primarily by Doug James from Stanford that I'm aware of. There are people who consider, you know, taking a homogenized approach to this, where you're not actually representing and simulating the individual yarns, but then of course you're going to surface-based representations. And in computer graphics, more often than not, those are going to be triangle mesh-based linear finite elements, geometrically nonlinear, but piecewise affine triangle mesh representations. So it depends if you're trying to resolve each individual yarn or not. I'm curious,
okay,
actually.
We have a queue for other. Should we move on? Right.
Sure.
So in fact, the next person in the queue is. Thank you for your patience, Zulin Zhang.
Hi, this is Sulim from Penn State. Thank you, Pedro and Basile and Eitan for giving this wonderful talk. So my question is sort of following the previous questions. What's beyond the elasticity? So people, I think John specifically mentioned about the biological filaments. So when we talk about this very soft filaments, so I suppose that entropy play a very, very important role. So we call this rods, not elastic rods. We call them entropic rods. Or at the regime, both elasticity and entropy play a role. We'll talk about elastic entropic rods. Do you guys have any attention to move into that direction to apply what we have in the biological field? Say you have microtubules, you have this flexible filaments inside the cells.
Well, I think there are essentially two ways that entropic rod could be connected to what we do. One would be to run a sort of Monte Carlo simulation, so where you actually simulate the noise, but the noise and the thermal agitation. But for that, you could use a discrete elastic model as an underlying model. That's a possibility. And another option is to do some averaging and find an effective model that captures the entropic effect. I mean that also to some extent could apply the numerical methods such as a discrete elastic model. So I see two options. One to be to represent explicitly the thermal agitation, and the other one would be to treat it analytically and simulate a different model. But in principle, I think both approaches could at some point make a connection with the types of method we were discussing.
So I think
Maddocks is an expert on that type of thing.
Yeah, one of you guys mentioned about the DNA, similar to DNA. I suppose DNA is also very semi-flexible. If you don't incorporate entropy into your model, and then you want to be able to, I don't know would that be a realistic model or
well, so now you're in a very, very dangerous
John
question.
Maddocks is the expert on that.
I know, but it's very dangerous. If I'm the chairman, I should go to the queue of people. So there's a large literature on that. Let me just say that. Well, I mean, in some sense, Basile was talking about how, or mentioned how you can get the constitutive relations. You get the Kirchhoff theory by taking the limit of three-dimensional elasticity with small cross sections, and then there's asymptotics. So in the case where you're trying to model things where there's lots of energy in the solvent, you can get constitutive relations by matching statistics. You just match first and second moments. and then you can get constitutive relations that way. And then the entropy is somehow in there. But I mean, I'd be happy to talk about that for hours, but nobody else would be. So are there other panelists who'd like to reply to that question? No. Okay, so let's move on. So then next is Yibin Fu. Did I butcher the name? Or
yeah, yes, yeah. Hi,
oh, there we go. There we go. Hello.
Hi, Yibin.
Hi. First, a big thank you to the three speakers for this stimulating talk. I have a question to Basile. You mentioned very briefly at the end that the elegant reduction method you developed in a series of recent papers. Now, in the method, you start by assuming your solution is very, very slowly along the main direction. But it seems that your model is also does give very, very good results in the fully nonlinear regime. And you made that claim in your papers as well. I have a rough idea why that is the case. I would like to hear from you why the model is also valid in the fully nonlinear regime. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, so I think what you mean really is how comes that a model that's derived under the assumption that everything varies slowly along the length also is able to handle sharp interfaces, right, and quick variations. Well, I mean, honestly, I don't know, and that was essentially the conclusion of the last paper we had, that we were surprised that it works as well. So mathematically, the assumptions that we do seems to be at odds with the context in which we end up using the model, and still the results are virtually indistinguishable from the predictions. So I don't know, and I would be interested by any insights that you would have on that question. But just to clarify, we have. I mean, you saw that in the inflated balloon, where there are two types of zones, so two very different radii in the different places of the balloon, and the connection between the two regions, the transition region, really takes place over a length that's comparable to the radius, and that's normally what we call quickly varying solutions, and these are normally excluded by the assumptions of the dimensional reduction. But still, I mean, if you run the 1D model and compare the solutions of the 1D model that has this slow approximation to the solution of the original membrane model, which makes no approximation, you get almost perfect agreement. So again, that to me, that's something I don't understand. We suspect that there's something that escapes us. One approach would be to push, because our dimension reduction is really an expansion. So an approach would be to push the expansion farther and see what the next orders look like, and estimate what we have actually neglected and see how large it is in this transition region. But if there's a simple answer and you have insights, I'd be interested.
I thought the reason is your expansion is in a small neighborhood of the inhomogeneous solution.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, once you get that correct, then it does not matter whether the variation is fast or slow. For instance, in the case of a tube, because the primary deformation can capture the two-phase solutions, then the transition solution does not matter very much. Is that the
yeah, but I mean, I see what you say, but still mathematically the terms that we ignore and the gradients, they become for the one when you have a transition from one radius to a markedly different radius over a length comparable to the radius itself. So things that we did neglect in the mathematical solution are for the one, and there's no reason why the expansion works so well. Now you're pointing to an interesting thing, that the way we do the expansion improves over past work, in the sense that we probe the homogeneous nonlinear regime exactly. So we make no approximation that we stay close to the same solution everywhere. But still, it doesn't seem to be sufficient to warrant that the agreement is so good as we observe.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Hopefully we can talk face to face one day.
I'm looking forward to.
So there was older work, I guess, in the late 70s of Dick James and I think Roger Fosdick. So they also had rod theories, which were nonlinear functions of the strain. So like the classic example then is like a cocktail straw, right? Where the cross section, so you make a rod theory for a tube, and then if it buckles, then the cross section can collapse. And again, they had theories, and I think compared with experiment as well. Okay, very good. So I got a private message from Alan Gorielli that his internet connection was slightly unstable. Is Alan there? Alan,
I'm back.
There you go.
Thanks, John. It's very nice to see so many good and nice people are on the table. It looks like the FBI most wanted list of mechanics of some kind. And thank you for the beautiful talk, guys. So I saw a few nice examples, and we talk about example coming from biology. We talk about DNA, we talk about hair, flagellum, and all that. And we also play about the role of entropy in this system. So another kind of feature of this system that's important in rods and that you see in a lot of examples is the actual active conversion of energy that you find in some systems. For instance, sperm, we know that expend energy in order to move, the tail of the sperm and so on. It can also grow, so it can change the geometry. So my question to the three of you is, how would you see a generalization of rod theory to include active effects, active forces, active stress, conversion of energy, and so on? And more important, maybe that's more for Pedro, how could we realize at the laboratory level a system that has these features?
Well, thank you. And I can have a go at the first part of your question. So one way to do that, and it's been proposed in different papers, and it's actually the simplest way, is to introduce some natural curvature or natural stretch. So define the reference curvature, the reference configuration as being curved, and now making this reference curvature a function of time, right? It's just essentially the idea of a snake that sets locally its natural curvature to be non-zero and then propagates this information backwards. So there are quite a few papers on that. And if you look at that from an energetic point of view, then this change of natural curvature as a function of time and space amounts to bring in some energy in the system. So that's really the work done by the internal stress or the natural curvature can be positive, can bring energy to the system. So that's probably the easiest way to implement what you're describing. And again, there are a few papers on that, right? Does that answer your question, or do you have something?
Not quite. Usually it's done at the level of the kinematic, as you say. I can vary the parameter and put arbitrary function. What I'm thinking is
now there's the question of how that can be justified, right?
Yeah, but I'm probably a little bit more ambitious, where we would have an entire system that includes actual conversion of energy within this system at the thermodynamic level. That would be probably more meaningful. I know we can, you can vary parameter, you can change arc lengths in the appropriate way to model a number of things, and that works great. And you can find a lot of phenomenology playing with these games. But I'm thinking a little, how would we have a more general theory that would both have sink and sources of entropy in the system? And the sink of entropy are this conversion of energy from typically the cellular level down up to the tissue level.
So on the experiment,
go ahead, Pedro. Sorry.
Yeah, on the experimental front, it's probably not going to answer your question, because I think what you have in mind is really a biological system where you have this flow from small scale to the structure scale, right? Certainly one way to make active filamentary structures is to use external fields. So there was a question earlier about magnetic rods. So that's something that others have tried. So in PMMH, in Paris, Ramiro Godoya and his team, they've looked at these swimming magnetic swimmers, and so through external fields, of course, is possible, either magnetic or light active polymer materials as well, where you're precisely affecting the kinematics through external effects. On the magnetic front, we certainly, I mean, we're working on that, as we said earlier. But in the other direction, from the microscopic scale, the internal structure scale to the structure scale, that honestly, I just don't have ideas how I would implement that in the lab.
Zigan has an idea.
Okay, so
Zigan,
we're done on that. Let me, just as a logistical question, we're having, I still can't see hands. If anybody's queuing up and would still like to ask a question, send me a private message, okay? Because that's actually how we're going to do it. Sorry? Who?
Jigang Suo is waving his hand. Jigang, probably you can unmute yourself.
Oh, I just have a general question outside this field. Now, of course, I'm an engineer. So the traditional reason to analyze the structure is about the stiffness, strength, fracture, this kind of issue. Right. So to some extent, this classical rod theory was formulated to address these issues. But now you have a totally different application, this computer graphics. So the purpose is not to compute strength or stiffness. It's fooling people's eyes, right? It's a totally different purpose. So I just want to know from that perspective, there must be totally different theory approach to address this new application, i.e. fooling people's eyes. So Eitan, can you say something about what people do other than realistically model physics? Because fooling people's eyes have nothing to do with the strength, stiffness per se.
Yeah, well, okay, so let me start by saying that what people actually do really depends on people's philosophy. You have some film studios which traditionally have just said, oh, just model everything as mass springs and then tweak things until it looks good. And they and the reason a lot of studios have moved away from that and have actually moved to things like Kirchhoff rod theory is because of the huge amount of human time that goes into adjusting the parameters and tweaking them when they're not the right parameters. Or worse, producing simulations that are the best they can produce after many iterations that are still not good enough. I mean, they are good enough by the standards of 10, 15 years ago, but not good enough by the standards of movies today. And so then they hire 40, 50, 70 artists to sit and literally do, you know, cellular animation in the style of Walt Disney, you know, 20 years ago, basically paint over each frame to make it look good. They still do this for fluid simulations. They still do this for hair simulations. So other studios are kind of basically from the top down, from management down, taking a more principled approach and saying, no, we really need to simulate reality. If we want it to look like reality, we have to start from the models that are as close as possible to reality. In that sense, it's no coincidence that a lot of the collaborations have been with Peter Jackson's studio in New Zealand, What a Digital is, because the chief of the director of visual effects there, Joe Letteri, basically the boss there, just wants everything to be based on the correct physical equations. That just makes for a good collaboration. But if you really think about it and you look at the rod theory, the way we've implemented it, my argument is, maybe to be more controversial, that I fundamentally disagree with you, okay? If you really care about all the engineering details, maybe you really have to really measure the constitutive law for your specific material. And you have to really get all the boundary conditions and all the tribological effects exactly right. But if you care about getting the overall look of it, you just have to properly capture the characteristic behavior of the slender structure, which you can do by discretizing really the geometric aspects of the rod theory without worrying as much about the specific stress-strain relationship of the material itself. So maybe that's not as good as you want for predicting if your structure will collapse or not, but maybe it's good for getting all the qualitative aspects of the system right, which does matter for the eyeball, for what Babushka called the eyeball metric.
Oh, in a different context.
Yeah.
But
Eitan, maybe I have following up on what Eitan was just saying. I remember you saying something about how the eye is particularly sensitive to geometrically flawed representations, whereas if you mess up momentum conservation or energy conservation, the eye is much more lenient and forgiving. Why is that? Can you expand on that?
I don't remember exactly saying that, but I don't remember exactly saying that, but I can use that to bring up something called the uncanny valley. Have you heard of the uncanny valley? This is something that people talk about when they're doing films and animation and computer graphics. Essentially, the uncanny valley is, if you look at the Simpsons cartoons or Flintstones or something like that, or Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs hand-drawn, it's all very clearly hand-drawn, and correspondingly your expectations for how realistic the motion is or how realistic the physics is are corresponding to the fact that your eye sees this as all very hand-drawn. If you look at some of the completely virtual characters in Avatar or The Hobbit or Alita Battle Angel, I had one of the slides up in the talk for that, but then my computer died. My internet connection died. Those are all made to look very realistic. If you look at a still frame, they're very realistic. As soon as the visual rendering is, indistinguishable from a photograph of a person, it becomes very uncanny if the motion is distinguishable, right? Or if the motion of the character is overall indistinguishable from real life and the rendering of the character is indistinguishable from real life. But the deformations and physics of the passive objects around them, like the hair or clothing, betray that it is a simulation. It becomes very uncomfortable, very uncanny. Your brain doesn't know if it's looking at something real or something fake. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be. So the typical plot that we show for people's satisfaction, if here is, let's see, so if here is ground truth, physical reality, and here is completely animated and clearly hand-drawn, and then people's satisfaction is like high here and high here, but in between it gets, sorry, I'm sorry, I should start again. No, basically the point is there's a dip, and the dip occurs close to reality, but not at reality, because people are very uncomfortable with something that is really trying to be real, but doesn't achieve it. You either want to be clearly fake or you want to get it dead on. And I argue that to get it dead on, you really do need to capture those physical models to the best of our ability.
But Eitan, let me ask this question, Pedro's question again, in a slightly different way. So, for example, today, if you say your model is good or not in terms of predicting stiffness, I do a measurement. I don't argue with you. You predict displacement, force, or the fracture. I don't argue with you. Now today, if you say, well, this is real enough or not, do you guys have some kind of measurement Pedro can
yes,
new kind of engineering measurement Pedro can do?
Absolutely.
Tell you this model is great.
Yes, we have an absolute measurement. It's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitive, and there's no arguing with it. Just like there's no arguing with your measurement.
Yeah. So what measurement is that?
So every day, around 11 a.m., there's something called the dailies. In the dailies, each department in the film studio brings its latest renderings, its latest shots. Some departments are in charge of getting realistic lighting.
Yeah.
Some departments are getting the motion. Some are capturing human motion. Some, and so on and so forth. And the head of the studio reviews all the shots during the dailies and says, this is okay, this is done, or this needs to change in these ways.
Okay.
Interesting.
No negotiation.
So now I have a...
Now, I don't work at the studios, but I've sat in a few of the dailies. And essentially, it's the eyes of the one person who's trusted to do quality control for that studio.
Okay.
Now, do the researchers like me subject themselves to the dailies? No. So if you look at the discrete elastic rods paper, of course, the way that we approached it there is by a combination of some of the validation examples that Basile brought up in his slides. Those were in the discrete elastic rods paper. And by visual comparisons to make sure that qualitatively we're getting the right deformations. But those are the ones we use to publish the paper. In the film studios, that's not how it works. In the film studios, the big shot says yes or no.
Okay, so I think we have a philosophical question, which is how to simulate a realistic orc. But let's move on, I think, okay? So the next in the queue is Glaucio Paulino. Sorry if I'm butchering people's names. Glaucio, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you. Probably my question has already been addressed, but maybe I will ask it. Maybe there is some light that can be shed by asking the question. And I was inspired by Yibin, Zhigang, and Alan Gorielli's questions. And also the conclusion of the talk, where you guys said you are looking at extreme rods. And now when we come back to the trio, right, to the intersection here, the combination of the experiments, the simulation, and the theory, the mathematics, one of the things that I noticed is that during the presentation, you guys take tremendous pride when you match exactly the experiments with the simulations. Why do you have to match the experiments with the simulations?
I think we should clarify one thing. In the cases where you have some kind of tuning parameters and you play with them until you match, that's an exercise for the student or whoever is doing it. I mean, you have these tuning parameters. I think what's interesting is when you don't have tuning parameters and you just run the simulation and superimpose it on the experiments and they match. I think that's worth remarking about, because there wasn't a process of matching the simulations. There was just an excellent match observed.
Eitan, that's precisely my question. That's precisely my question.
Yeah.
And I can elaborate a little bit. Because, for example, I was motivated by, there is a TED lecture by Murray Gell-Mann, the Nobel Prize winner. And if you look in the first 3 minutes of the TED lecture, then what he points out is that he and a few of his colleagues, and maybe Einstein was involved, they did a piece of theoretical work, and it violated at that time 7 experiments. 7, and the best experimentalists in the world. It turned out later, many years later, that all the experiments were wrong. Pedro may not like this, but anyway, it's a true story. And what I mean is that maybe you, with all the beauty of a simulation, mathematics, experiments and theory that you have, maybe not looking for this match, or looking, for example, at the beauty of some of these theoretical equations may allow you to discover something else.
So you know, as we discussed before, I'll send you an e-transfer of funds later for asking this question. So you know,
Chairman, I need money too.
Okay. So you know, one of the slides that we decided to cut out of the talk today, but that we, you know, we've presented in the past, is one of the anecdotes for why it doesn't make sense to try to actively match, but it's important to observe whether you have a match. And I don't know if it makes sense to bring up the slide now or just tell the story, but in fact, we do have a story where we had disagreement and where indeed the experiments were wrong. So when we first started the collaboration between Pedro and I, we wanted to just see not coiling spaghetti on a moving belt, but just coiling spaghetti on a substrate that's not moving, and just kind of see it coil. And Pedro created movies of this. And every few turns, the rod would kind of pick itself up and then turn in the other direction. And he sent us over the basic parameters, you know, rod thickness, the height, the rate of dropping, and our rod in the simulation would always turn in the same direction. Okay. So being graphics people, what I did is I just hired 30 artists to paint over the animation frames and make it turn in the other direction so that we could send and publish a paper on this, which is at PNAS now. So half of the frames in that paper are drawn by hand, but don't tell other people.
This is the joke.
No, of course, this is a joke.
This is being recorded on YouTube. Careful.
That was the budget.
Of course, this is a joke. So the actual way the story continued, I tend to joke with a straight face. It's a little bit dangerous. So, of course, what actually happened is that we observed that we weren't getting the match, and we started debating, you know, maybe the friction is wrong, maybe this is wrong. And as far as we were concerned, we had accounted for all the correct ingredients. And so, in a sense, we gave up. We paused on this, and the student Jun-Suk Ju, who's now a professor at UCLA, he went on to do more serious stuff. He actually went to work at Weta Digital on The Hobbit. And while he was there, at some point, I guess he got inspired and he tried something, and he sent back animations where the coiling was now inverting at the right frequency, every correct number of turns. And this was matching very well. And what the email exchange from New Zealand to Boston to Cambridge was something like this: Pedro, by any chance, are you storing your rods on a spool of such and such diameter? And the response came back and said, how did you guess the spool to within 1% of its diameter?
I see.
Okay, and so the role of the matching was to identify what the missing ingredient was. The missing ingredient that hadn't been accounted for is the natural curvature.
Yeah.
And by matching, we were able to predict what is the natural curvature in the rods where the experiments had not been at that time yet designed to control natural curvature. So that then led Pedro to go back and say, how do we now fabricate rods with different amounts of natural curvature? Which at the time, I believe you used the pillars at MIT, right?
No, so that was before that. So the problem is that these elastomeric rods, we were just buying them from McMaster, and I guess when they spool them after fabrication, the polymer is not fully cured, and so they end up taking the curvature of the spool, and we just thought that wasn't important, right? And so see, I completely second what you said, Glaucio, regarding it's precisely the mismatch. I mean, just having success stories doesn't get you anywhere, right? But it's precisely the mismatch and the struggle that leads you to discovery. I know this is a little fact, right? The discovery of that natural curvature matter. But if you go through our paper, we then fully characterize the role of natural curvature, which completely changes the behavior depending on what's there or not. But I maybe if you allow me to step back a little bit, I think it's an interesting question, right? Why do we try to predict things? I could reframe your question to do so, and it's a challenge. It's a challenging exercise. It's fun, right? So there's a cultural aspect there that is just fun to be able to predict reality, and then it might be useful for something, whether it's to fool the eyes of moviegoers or to build something. But I think the struggle of trying to match something that is reality. I mean, that's something that I thrive on. But of course, when we show you this match, it comes up, oh, it works. There's a few success story cases, but of course the process is never so linear.
And also I think there are two aspects in the question. So some of the validations we showed were really to make sure that the model was correctly represented by the numerics, which is something you really want to be sure about. But then there's another option once you know that the numerics is doing the correct thing, is whether this particular model, it can be the Kirchhoff rod with linear constitutive equations or whatever, whether it applies to a particular experiment, and that's often much more uncertain. So the validation we showed are in a very limited context. We have control over everything. We want to reproduce some reference solution that's known to hold, and there's no there's no option that the numerical results should give exactly the same results. But then when we turn to real experiments where there are other factors which we don't fully master, there's always this thrill that do we have the correct models? Is it going to work? We never know, and that's probably the thrill that makes it fun and interesting.
So Eitan has this nice picture of how different it is that I guess a theorist or a computational researcher does compared to an experimentalist. Can I paraphrase you, Eitan, on this one, and then you see?
Sure, go ahead.
Right, so how, if you're a theorist or a computational mechanician or a computational person in general, what you do, you try to add ingredients until you have just the right ones, right? As an experimentalist, you do the exact opposite. You have the whole messy reality, and you try to get rid of them until you have just the ones that matter. And sometimes I think you can make mistakes, right? An experimentalist, you leave something there that is an artifact that you thought wasn't important or you didn't even realize was there. And so that mindset drives our process of coming to these physical model systems to really get down to the essential. And it's not a trivial process, right? I mean, through experience, you learn what to take away, but not too much. Whereas in computation is the exact opposite. It's the experience of knowing what you have to add in that is physically and mathematically correct until you get what you need. And I never realized this difference in approaches, in mindsets, and until Eitan pointed it out clearly like that. But I think it really represents, and then of course there's some people aware of that and they do both of that in their work. But I know, little anecdote, but I think is an interesting way to look at how different we are at doing similar things.
Thank you.
Okay, so intrinsic curvature is how you go from genomes to how DNA functions. But I'm not going to tell you any more. You have to pay me to tell you more. Ji Gang, you were in the queue, but then you asked. Did you want to ask another question?
Oh, no, no.
Okay.
Simon want to ask a question.
No, not yet. Tahir first.
Okay.
Then Simon. Or Simon, whichever. Okay, so I now have two. I have Tahir.
I can see that. Yeah, I have wrote my, up there. I say thank you all the three speakers, really fascinating talk. In today's talk, all the informations about the solid rods, any new research work on the hollow rods, and that information will be very welcome to introduce today. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So you're talking about hollow cylindrical tubes, right?
In the hollow rod, you see, whether it's a solid rod, you can have a soft and hard rod. Now that doesn't change that it's a hollow rod. Now this question, as a matter of fact, coming from my gardening work, the water pipes. When I use the water pipe, you see, it all entangled and make a knot, and sometimes it just it's like a squeeze. Now, say whether you have some sort of mechanics research work on this type of rods. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
We actually recently published a paper about a solid tube for a particular application. It is motivated by this a water pipe. So because it's a rubber pipe, when you bend it, you lose stability, you cause a kink. That kink serves as a valve, immediately shut off water. So we use this instability as a valve. Reis says, and we published a bunch of papers just using that as a force-induced valve. Very effective.
Thank you, Jigang. Thank you.
So this is one of the problems we want to explore with our method. So the effect is known as the brazier effect. So when you bend the cylindrical tube, the cross section becomes oval and then tends to flatten, and that's really a nonlinear effect where the tube realizes that by changing, affording some energy cost to bend the cross section pays off in the end because it lowers the bending modulus. So that's really a nonlinear effect where by changing the cross section you can ultimately lower the energy, and that's really the type of effects that we know we can handle with our reduction method. So a question we are asking, we're working on it precisely at the moment, is what is a good 1D model for this type of complex structures with deformable cross section.
For example,
not sure we will take water into account, but there are also tape springs that do essentially the same thing. So tape springs are the open version of the tube. It's just a rectangle, a shell that's a long rectangle with some transverse curvature. And it does exactly the same thing. It has a highly nonlinear response because by flattening out the cross section, it can lower the bending modulus, and that gives rise to a softening effect and so instabilities. And we are working on what is a good 1D beam-like model for these structures, which really look like 1D stuff.
So
okay, thank you.
I don't remember what they did, but that was the motivation of this Dick James and Roger Fosdick article for the non-convex elastica, was exactly the buckling of hollow tubes.
Well, now, so
I don't remember the details of that, but yeah.
The tricky part in these systems is that you need both nonlinearity because the stiffness obviously is not constant, but you also need the gradient effect. So if you have a non-convex energy and you set up a standard rod model, then you will have sharp interfaces. Like in Ericsson bars and stuff like that. So the tricky part, and that's where I think our method can really help, is that you need to capture the gradient effect correctly, pretty much like in the cylindrical balloon. You need to capture the shape of the interfaces, and you're not happy with just a discontinuity. So that's exactly what we are working on.
Okay. Tang Li has been patiently waiting, or maybe is no longer patiently waiting. Tang Li?
I'm still patient.
Very good. There you go. All right.
Thank you. Jimmy mentioned that this is actually marks the third month of EML webinar. Indeed, this webinar is the very first time we have three co-presenters giving the same EML webinar, which turns out to be terrific, especially given that the three speakers are actually from very different fields. Mechanics, applied mathematics, and computer science. So I guess I have questions, actually 2 questions. Let me set up my stage to ask my questions. Okay, hopefully this works. So I don't know if you can see this circle here.
Yes, we can.
Okay, now this circle can freely move around on this piece of paper. right? And imagine there are many these circles moving around, okay? Then one day, circle A met circle B, right? So you see the overlap. So the shaded area is the overlap area. Now, suppose this overlap area is large enough, then the circle A and the circle B decided, okay, let's keep our distance, let's move together. Then they moved together one day, they met circle C. Immediately you see that the overlap area of three of them are smaller than the overlap area between two circles. Okay, now I set up my state. Here's my question, okay. Now, if this circle represents the knowledge base of each of you, then the overlap will be the language you can talk to each other. You understand each other, right? So now, then you decided, okay, three of you decided, okay, let's move together. Now, my question is, since from this webinar, I can tell that three of you are really talking in each other's language. I don't really see much of the, you understand each other very well. But any question from the audience, each of you can understand it quickly, and probably one of the person is the best person to answer this question. How did you overcome this initial, running into each other in a rather random, probably in your case, it's not random, but for other people, try to formulate this or cultivate this collaboration, you need to talk to each other's language. Now, that's my first question. The second question is, now, if this circle means the research interest, right? So then, which means that you need to maintain this shaded area large enough to attract three of you together, right? To move around, and then you grow, right? So when you grow, hopefully you want to grow like this. Now, what if that, because everyone is free to grow, what if we grow something like this? The big circle eventually drift away, and then you don't really find much of a common interest over there. It seems that so far, three of you are maintaining this mode very nicely, growing simultaneously. How did you achieve that?
So first,
second question.
So first, a joke, which is when we first met, indeed, the only word we had in common was rod, and the conversations were very much like rod. But I think a couple things. One is there has to be a necessary ingredient is you have to be genuinely interested in learning how someone from another community thinks. You have to see value in understanding this. And certainly for me, you write enough computer graphics papers, enough computer science papers. And actually my undergraduate was in engineering science. So but never doing research. At some point you want to say, okay, how does an engineer write a paper? How do you write a PNAS paper? Computer scientists can write them, but how does a mechanics person write a paper? How do you write a PRL paper? What are the right questions to ask? What's interesting? What isn't? You have to see some value in gaining from that. And I think if you do, then you naturally pick up some of the language over time. And hopefully that goes in both directions. The other, I think Pedro was always hoping for a movie credit, but that hasn't happened just yet. The other thing to note is that, interestingly enough, thus far, although the three of us have been friends and have talked research many times together as a group, the projects have always been bilateral in all three different combinations. And so maybe that actually talks to your Venn diagram and the fact that there's more overlap when any pair looks. Actually, I attribute it more to something else, not to the knowledge overlap and not to the research question overlap, because we've talked many times, for example, about knots, and all of us have had interest in it. I attribute that more to timing. A lot of our research depends on having the right grad student come along at the right time. And the more groups you have involved trying to do this, the harder it can be to get all the stars to align in terms of resources and timing and availability to focus on a problem. The third thing is that you have an assumption there, I think, is that this group of bubbles then always moves together. But in some sense, well, that's very romantic. My hope in some other sense is that these bubbles also move around and meet other bubbles and form other collaborations and never lose their love for being in that configuration, but are open to being in other configurations as well.
Yeah, you know, when you grow all together, and then you have a larger area to interface with other circles.
Yeah.
While you maintain this overlap together.
It's not only
there cannot be a sorry, so I'm going to interrupt. So I think I'll now say that there cannot be a better question to end on. So I'll declare that to be the last question. But now there's two speakers who haven't had a chance to answer. So Basile, and then if you like Pedro, and then I propose we're done.
Okay.
Okay.
I just say it's not only a matter of areas. So you in your graph, you showed that the intersection with 3 disks is smaller, but the kind of problem that lie in that tiny intersections are those that have never been explored, because it's obviously a lot harder to combine 3 people from different places. So even though there are fewer problems, they are also the ones that have never been looked at and might be more interesting.
Pedro, the last word.
I don't know, too much pressure. I don't know what to say. I don't know. I think research is all about playing in the playground, right? I mean, you go into the sandbox, you play, and you don't necessarily end up playing with all the kids in the playground. You end up just clicking with a few, and you have fun. And I think that's what it's all about, beyond the results and so on. And yeah, sometimes if there's only a card, then it makes sense for 2 to play, and sometimes there's room for more, but there needs to be that click of fun for a collaboration to work, and it's all it's very rewarding, and yeah, so I don't know. I'll finish on a low note to try not to say anything else.
Yeah, I modified this based on the discussion here. It seems not only the overlap area for all 3 of them, but also the bilateral interest area also dynamically drive this collaboration as well.
But I mean, just a comment as well, which will probably be very pragmatic. But of course, you know, here funding can play a big role, right? So if you have the flexibility of reallocating someone in your lab to work on X, and because you've talked to a colleague and you want to work on it, then great. But that's often very difficult, right? So here, and I mentioned this earlier, and so the collaborative research grant that we had from NSF was crucial in the early days to really crystallize this, right? And so I think that there must be more room for having the flexibility to precisely not just be kind of a one PI or a big collaboration with many groups, but to have.
Or you move to Switzerland.
But I think it's very important.
Yeah. Very good. So I think we should graciously, it's a serious time. We're heading for 2 hours of discussion. I think it's time to wrap up. I think on behalf of the audience, I can thank the 3 speakers very much. On behalf of the speakers and the panelists, I think we can thank the audience. I apologize again for everybody's names I butchered. I think everybody got to ask.
And thank you, John.
You're very welcome. Hopefully I was still polite. And actually, we stopped recording a while ago. I got a message, but maybe that's not true. So is there anything technical to be done then? I guess we're just done, right? We all say goodbye, bon appetit.
Yeah.
Have a real drink.
Everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.